The mirror in the hallway shattered, not with the sharp, clean crack of breaking glass, but with a guttural groan, like something ancient and resentful being torn open. Shards rained down, scattering across the threadbare rug like frozen tears. My hand instinctively went to the heavy mag light strapped to my belt, my other to the worn leather of my jacket. But it was useless. This wasn't something you could fight with a flashlight, and in the jagged web of the broken glass, I saw her, not a distorted reflection of myself, gaunt and perpetually exhausted, but her face, pale and bloated, hair stringy with what looked like pond scum and something else, something slimy and black. Her lips, impossibly wide, curled into a grotesque, malicious smile that promised absolute ruin. A chill, damp and bone-deep, seeped from the fractured glass, wrapping around me like a funeral shroud. It smelled of stagnant water and old fear, a scent I was becoming intimately familiar with. It had all started, as these things always did, with a wrong turn, a job listing too good to be true, and a deep-seated refusal to listen to my own damn instincts. I was in a town I barely remembered the name of, somewhere in the forgotten folds of upstate New York, trying to keep my head down and pay the bills. The listing was for a temporary caretaker of an empty property on Lakeview Lane. Distressed sale, the ad had said. Owners relocated suddenly. A red flag, of course. Everything's a red flag in my life now. But the pay was good. The hours were antisocial, meaning I wouldn't have to deal with much daylight or people. And it was far enough off the beaten path that I figured I could disappear for a month or two. So I'd pack my go bag, the one with the cash and the first aid kit, and left Buster with an old, grizzled trucker I knew who didn't ask questions. It gnawed at me, leaving him, but I couldn't risk bringing him into whatever fresh hell awaited me. He was the one pure thing I had left, and I'd be damned if I let him get caught in my personal storm. The house itself sat on a cul-de-sac, its lawn a little too long, its paint a little too faded. It screamed abandoned, but not in the charming, rustic way, more in the something terrible happened here way. The air carried a strange chill, even before I stepped out of my beat-up pickup, the kind of cold that settled in your teeth and made the hair on your arms stand on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, a sensation that had become as common as breathing. The dim glow of the streetlights outside my window cast eerie shadows on the walls of the vacant living room, and the distant wail of a train whistle seemed unnaturally loud in the suffocating stillness. This wasn't just a quiet house. It was holding its breath. My hand went to my old analog wristwatch, a familiar nervous tick, tracing the cold metal of the casing, checking the time I already knew. Midnight. Always midnight. The first few nights were just off. Not actively hostile. Just wrong. The kind of wrong that made your skin crawl. The floorboards groaned when no one was walking. Doors that I'd left ajar would be closed, and ones I'd shut firmly would swing open, revealing gaping darkness beyond. I'd wake in the dead of night to the sound of something dragging itself across the upstairs floor, a wet, scraping sound that set my teeth on edge. I've learned to trust those visceral reactions, that animalistic clench in the gut, that prickle on the nape of the neck. It's kept me alive longer than any rational thought. Logic tends to take a vacation when you're dealing with the impossible. I started doing my own digging, beyond the vague real estate blurb. My job was to keep the place secure, but my cynical curiosity, that reluctant conscience of mine, always dragged me deeper than necessary. I found old mail in the kitchen drawer, utility bills, junk mail, all addressed to a Henry Miller. No Evelyn. Interesting. The place had a stale, unloved smell, like old water in a forgotten vase. As I walked through the empty rooms, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, a heavy blanket that seemed to muffle my own thoughts. The previous occupants had left in a hurry. That much was clear. There were still marks on the walls where pictures had hung, dust bunnies the size of small animals, and in one corner of the living room, a faint, dark stain on the carpet that I couldn't quite identify. It smelled vaguely metallic. Blood? I wouldn't have been surprised. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom of the master bedroom. It was sparse, almost clinical, as if stripped of all personality. But there was something in the closet, pushed behind a stack of forgotten cardboard boxes, a small, hidden camera, its red light blinking faintly, indicating a power source. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a family that left. This was a family that had been watching something or someone. My mind immediately went back to that cramped apartment in Ohio, to Mitch, or what I thought was Mitch, and the man who wasn't a man at all, living in the walls, the same sick, insidious feeling of a breach, a violation of the most intimate space. I swallowed, the taste of ash in my mouth. This was starting to feel less like a temporary gig and more like another layer of the curse I carried. I found a second camera, smaller, almost perfectly concealed behind a loose floorboard in what was clearly a nursery. A tiny, almost imperceptible red glow. It sent a fresh wave of dread through me, colder than the already frigid air. A nursery. What kind of horrors had unfolded here, watched by unblinking, mechanical eyes? My hands, calloused and rough from years of manual labor, trembled as I retrieved a small, encrypted hard drive from the back of the camera. This wasn't my business. Of course, I should have just left it, collected my pay and driven away. But the image of that small room, the crib, the silent witnesses, hooked me, my fatal flaw, rearing its ugly head yet again. Back in the living room, I hooked the hard drive up to my old, battered laptop, the one I kept in my go bag for emergencies. The screen flickered to life, showing endless hours of static. Then, faces. A man. Henry Miller, pale and haggard, his eyes hollowed out. And a woman. Evelyn. Even through the grainy camera footage, she radiated a strange, unsettling charisma. Her eyes, even when calm, seemed to hold a hint of something unhinged. They started as normal domestic scenes, then slowly, insidiously, devolved. Her words, when not distorted by the cheap mic, were sharp, cutting. "You're worthless without me, Henry," she would sneer, her voice dripping venom. Then came the physical attacks. A slap here, a shove there. Henry bore bruises that told stories he never dared to share. Her anger was like a storm, unpredictable and all-consuming. When she lashed out, the air itself seemed to grow heavy, suffocating. Her rage drained the light from the room, leaving only shadows. This was a different kind of horror than the things I usually faced. Human cruelty, festering into something monstrous. It reminded me, in a twisted way, of Ethan, the smooth-talking monster in the farmhouse, his charming smile hiding a literal gnawing hunger, the same insidious rot, just a different flavor of depravity. Hours passed. I watched, a morbid voyeur, as Evelyn's behavior escalated. She'd spend hours hunched on the couch, scratching at her scalp until her hair came away in clumps. Blood streaked her fingertips, and strands of her dark hair littered the floor. My stomach churned. This was a descent into madness, amplified by the silent, unblinking cameras. "I don't need help," she'd hiss, her eyes wild. "You're the one who's broken, Henry." And you could see in the way Henry's shoulders slumped, in the way his eyes became dull, that he'd begun to believe her. The weight of her words had crushed his self-worth until he didn't recognize himself. It was a familiar pattern, the way control slowly, meticulously stripped a person down to nothing. I knew a little something about being stripped down to nothing. Then came the chilling promises. "If you ever leave, I'll make sure you'll regret it forever." One night, the camera caught a glimpse of Henry's closet door, and taped to the inside, a note scrawled in her handwriting, "You'll never escape me." She knew. She always knew. The things that hunt me, they know too. They linger on the periphery, watching, waiting for the moment of weakness. Like the reflection I sometimes caught in store windows, the subtle shift in light that implied another presence. Or that pig creature, not quite real, not quite phantom, just at the edge of my vision. The climax of Henry's recorded nightmare was a crescendo of terror. "I'll kill you! Henry!" Evelyn screamed, her voice echoing through the small apartment. Henry, a shadow of the man he'd been, locked himself in the bedroom. The camera, still recording from its hidden perch, showed the door shake violently with each pound of her fists, like thunderclaps rattling the walls in his resolve. Her shrieks, guttural and feral, cut through the air like a blade, leaving him frozen in fear. The police arrived, and Evelyn, her arm burned from the stove, self-inflicted, I presumed, a twisted act of victimhood, stood ready with her accusation. "He did this to me." But Henry, miraculously, handed them the evidence, photos, videos, recordings. As they led her away in handcuffs, her face twisted into something unrecognizable, a mask of pure hatred. Her screams followed them long after the door shut behind her, echoing in the dead air of the house. I could still hear them, through the tinny laptop speakers, even though it had all happened years ago. The next few hours of footage were silent, empty, a strange calm after the storm. Then, a year later, the footage picked up again, showing Henry, looking cautiously hopeful, with a new woman, Lily. She was vibrant, a stark contrast to Evelyn's darkness. They cleaned, they painted, they brought in new furniture, and then a baby, a tiny crib in the nursery, next to the hidden camera. For a brief, dangerous moment, I felt a flicker of something close to hope for Henry, a clean slate, something I craved but knew was forever out of my reach. But as I'd learned too many times, there's no such thing as a clean slate when darkness has taken root. The calm was shattered by a phone call. The image of Lily on screen, her face white as a sheet, holding the phone away from her ear, then clutching it to her chest. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. But the context was clear. News had arrived. And then, Henry, collapsing into a chair, his head in his hands. Evelyn, I surmised, had found a way to continue her torment from beyond the grave. The obituary, a newspaper clipping I found tucked into an old photo album, confirmed it. Evelyn Rivers, 28, drowned in Lakeview. The haunting began subtly, almost imperceptibly in the recordings. Lights flickered without warning. Cold spots materialized in random corners of the apartment. Lily, initially, brushed them off as signs of exhaustion from caring for their newborn. But the growing unease in her eyes, even through the pixelated lens, told me she felt the presence she couldn't escape. "Henry, I heard someone crying last night," she whispered to him in one recording, clutching her mug of tea as if it could shield her from the truth. It sounded like a woman, but it didn't feel human. Her voice quivered, and I could see the strain this was putting on her. The fear was starting to seep into every part of their lives, eroding the trust and safety they had tried to build. This was a slow burn, a psychological torture that was far more insidious than the overt violence Evelyn had once inflicted. The silence of the house in the footage became more terrifying than any scream. Then the supernatural became undeniable. In one sequence, Henry sat alone in the living room, reading, the television off, suddenly sputtered to life. Static filled the screen before a familiar voice, distorted but unmistakable, emerged from the white noise. "You thought you could escape me?" Evelyn's voice, dripping with malice, filled the room. The static morphed into an image of her face, pale and distorted, her lips curling into that grotesque smile I'd just witnessed firsthand. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just a memory for them, it was happening. My own breaking point, The one that jolted me from morbid observer to unwilling participant came later that night. The crib, the same one I'd seen in the recordings, now empty in the nursery where I'd found the camera. It was soaked with water. The air around it was thick with a damp chill that made the hairs on my arms stand up. His tiny blanket, clammy to the touch, reeked faintly of lake water, a smell so pungent it brought bile to my throat. And clinging to the fabric, long, dark strands of hair, not just a few, but handfuls. Evelyn's hair. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The haunting wasn't just on the old recordings. It was present, active, here in the house, a malevolent shadow clinging to the place like a stain. My hand went to my watch, checking the time again. Even though it wasn't for time, it was for reassurance, a small, tangible anchor in a world that consistently defied logic. I needed to know the physical world still existed. The original story ended with Henry fleeing with his family, but the ghost of Evelyn, the haunting, clearly lingered. And now, I was here, another weary wanderer, caught in another localized horror, the cosmic joke, perpetually on me. I gathered the cameras and the hard drive, stuffing them into my go bag. I wasn't going to stick around for the full show. My conscience, however reluctant, had been satisfied. I'd seen what needed to be seen. I'd documented it. That was enough. I turned to leave the room, to walk out of that godforsaken house, to get in my truck and drive until the smell of lake water and old despair was a distant memory. But just as I reached the door, the temperature in the hallway plummeted, sucking the very warmth from my bones. It was the same cold I'd felt that night by the roadside, waiting for a tow, when a dead man had whispered impossible things in the snow-choked mountain pass. That cold, just before the real terror set in. And then the mirror, just across from me, exploded, not with a bang, but that awful wet, grinding groan, like something ripping, and her face in the shards, a malevolent grin. My breath hitched. This wasn't residual. This wasn't just a haunting of a place. This was personal. She was here for me. Why? Was it because I'd unearthed her story? Was I the new Henry? Was it simply because I was in her house? Or was it something deeper? Something about the mark I carried, the cosmic beacon I seemed to be for these things. The NDE, that brief, horrifying glimpse of the farm beyond death, had told me there was no escape, not even in oblivion. Now, I was facing a testament to that. Death was no release for Evelyn, and it offered no sanctuary from her either. You'll never be free. The voice, distorted and wet, seemed to come from the very air around me, not from the broken glass. It was Evelyn's voice, yes, but twisted, guttural, as if her throat were filled with mud and the screams of the drowned. Shadows stretched unnaturally long in the dim light, whispering my name in voices that sounded like hers but broken, disjointed. I could practically feel her presence, a cold, clammy hand on the back of my neck. I raised the mag light, its beam cutting a stark path through the gloom, but there was nothing there, only the shattered mirror, reflecting 100 fractured images of my own terrified face. My hand still went to the watch, a futile gesture. Lily, Henry's wife, had started keeping a knife under her pillow. The video had shown her eyes sunken with sleepless nights. Their son's laughter had turned to silence, as though he sensed the weight of what lurked around them. I was alone here, just me and Evelyn, and her fury, a storm that wouldn't dissipate. I knew, with the chilling certainty that comes from too much experience, that she wasn't done with me yet. Not by a long shot, and sometimes, in the dead of night, as the house groaned around me and the faint smell of lake water lingered, I wondered if she ever would be. This was just another chapter in a book I never asked to write, one where the monsters always found their way to my door, and I, the reluctant conscience, always found myself opening it. Character count. 99987. The air was thick with it, the metallic tang of fresh despair coating my tongue, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. Red. So much goddamn red. It painted the motel room walls, the ceiling, the floor, a grotesque Pollock in crimson and rust. My old leather jacket, heavy on my shoulders, suddenly felt like a lead blanket, pressing the nausea down into my stomach. Each breath I took felt heavy, as though the air itself was laden with dread, a chilling, suffocating weight that pressed in from every direction. The silence, when it finally settled after the initial shouts and panicked whispers, was worse. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a hungry, watchful quiet, the kind that swallows screams whole. My hand, as if on autopilot, went to my wrist, my thumb tracing the cold metal of my analog watch. The hands hadn't moved since some point in the early morning hours, stuck, mocking the frantic beat of my own heart. Funny how a simple missing persons call in a forgotten corner of Minnesota could end like this. It all started with an old woman in a closet that wouldn't stay shut. The town of Garrity was nothing more than a forgotten pinprick on a faded map. The kind of place you drove through only if you took a wrong turn off the interstate. I was just passing through, stringing together another string of transient, late-night shifts to keep the wolf from the door and the memories at bay. This time, it was a gig as a contract security guard for a local, laughably understaffed firm, essentially a glorified night watchman for a few businesses and the occasional residential call. It paid cash, and nobody asked too many questions. Perfect. It had been a gloomy, late March morning, the sky a bruised purple that promised more rain, the kind of day where the cold seemed to seep into your bones, settling there like an unwelcome guest. I'd been nursing a lukewarm cup of motel coffee, the kind that tasted like burnt plastic and regret, when Karen, the dispatcher, crackled over the cheap two-way radio they'd given me. Her voice, usually a sugary southern drawl, had an odd, brittle edge to it. "Possible 1082 at the Garrity residence," she'd announced, not quite hiding the tremor. "It's Eileen again. Eileen Garrity." Even I, a recent transplant to this particular stretch of flyover country, knew about Eileen. She was the local eccentric, the little old lady who cried wolf. Except her wolves were raccoons in the attic, strange lights in her cornfield, or, if the local gossip was to be believed, honest-to-God UFOs. People humored her. They'd send someone out, usually the part-time deputy, to tell her it was just a barn owl or a faulty streetlight. But Karen's tone this morning had been different. It was the same tone I'd heard once or twice before in other towns, a subtle shift from annoyed exasperation to something colder, something like genuine unease. My gut, a loyal but pessimistic companion, had tightened. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't watching, and I was always paranoid. "You want me to roll on that, Karen?" I'd asked, already pulling on my worn leather jacket. It was more a nervous tick than a question. My conscience, that persistent, irritating little voice I'd tried to drown out for years, was already nudging me. "Go. Check it out. Just in case." It was always just in case that dragged me into the deep end. "If you wouldn't mind, Vance," she'd replied, a sigh rustling through the static. "Jerry's tied up with a lost dog, and frankly, I think Eileen just needs someone to listen. You got that way about you." She probably meant, "Looks like he's seen too much and won't judge you for it." She wasn't wrong. So I found myself driving the dented, county-issued sedan, not a patrol car, just a civilian vehicle with a flashing yellow light on the dash, down a narrow, mud-slicked dirt track towards the Garrity farmhouse. The rain had started, a steady drumming against the windshield. Each drop a tiny drumbeat of impending doom. The scent of damp earth and something vaguely metallic, wet leaves and decay, perhaps, or something deeper, older, clung to the air. The farmhouse itself was a study in neglect, a crumbling monument to forgotten fears, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its windows vacant, staring eyes. "Mrs. Garrity was on the porch?" a hunched silhouette against the gray sky. My foot instinctively hit the brake pedal, the car lurching to a stop in the gravel. Even from a distance, her appearance sent a fresh shiver down my spine. She was gaunt, impossibly thin, her face hollowed out by what looked like weeks, maybe months, of sleepless nights. Her eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, stared out with a terrifying vacancy, yet also a frantic, animalistic fear. Her hands, gnarled and trembling, clutched at the edges of a tattered shawl, as if she were trying to ward off an unseen cold that had nothing to do with the March weather. She swayed slightly, like a reed in a high wind, as if her frail body could no longer bear the weight of whatever she was carrying. It was like the very life had been sucked out of her, leaving behind only an empty, trembling vessel. I'd seen that look before. Usually, it was on the faces of people who'd stared into the kind of abyss that stared back. And usually, I was the abyss. I killed the engine, the sudden silence of the car almost deafening after the rhythmic drumming of the rain. The kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of your own breathing, the frantic thump of your heart against your ribs. I grabbed my mag light from the passenger seat, the heavy barrel of familiar comfort in my hand, and stepped out into the biting chill. The gravel crunched under my boots as I approached the porch steps. "Mrs. Garrity." My voice sounded rough, unused. Her head snapped up, her eyes disturbingly wide, fixed on me. She didn't acknowledge my question, didn't even seem to register my presence as a person. Instead, her voice, a dry, raspy whisper, broke the oppressive quiet. "There's something in my house," she said flatly, utterly devoid of emotion. "Not someone, something." This wasn't a squirrel in the attic. This wasn't a reflection of the moon on her pond. This was the kind of statement that always preceded the kind of trouble I spent my life running from. My conscience, the miserable bastard, suddenly felt a lot less like a conscience and a lot more like a lead weight dragging me deeper into the mud. Inside, the house was worse than the neglected exterior suggested. The air hung thick and heavy, a cloying mix of stale air, dust, damp decay, and an underlying sharp scent that made the hairs on my arms prickle. Copper, almost. Something metallic. Dishes piled in the sink, their surfaces crusted with weeks-old food, green and gray with mold. Pillows and blankets were strewn across the couch like she'd been living there, huddling for days against some unseen terror. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of dust, except for the pathways she must have carved through it. The silence inside was different than outside. It hummed with an unnatural tension, as if the very air vibrated with recent violence. Then I saw them, shattered mirrors. They littered the floor in the living room, their jagged edges glinting in the dim light that filtered through the grimy windows. Each shard seemed to reflect not just the room, but fractured, distorted images of something unseen, twisted, shadowy shapes that hinted at forms both monstrous and unrecognizable. It was as though the shards captured glimpses of another realm, one filled with malevolence and lurking horrors waiting to break through. Or perhaps, the mirrors hadn't just broken. They had witnessed something too horrifying to contain, their shattered state a testament to the terror that lingered within the house. I had a sudden, cold thought. Were they broken from the inside? And the closets. Every single closet door had been crudely, violently boarded shut, the nails hammered in with visible, desperate haste, splitting the old wood around the nail heads. It was the kind of work done by someone who wasn't just trying to keep something out, but to keep something in. My hand went to my watch again, my thumb rubbing the cool metal, trying to ground myself in something tangible, something that followed rules. But rules, I knew, were often just suggestions to the things that crawled in the dark. "She's been living like this," I mumbled, more to myself than to Mrs. Garrity, who had slumped into a dusty armchair, clutching a worn rosary. The beads clicked together with a frantic rhythm. "Months," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper. "They started in the bedroom closet. My eyes scanned the room, landing on a dusty corner near the fireplace. Her husband's old hunting shotgun leaned there, abandoned. Two shells were on the floor beside it, glinting dully in the gloom. I knelt, my boots crunching on mirror shards, and carefully picked one up. It was still warm, the faint smell of gunpowder lingering. Someone had fired this recently, very recently. "What were you shooting at, Mrs. Garrity?" I asked. My voice calm, but my stomach was doing a slow, cold roll. Whatever it was, it had been close enough to shoot at, and it hadn't been a raccoon. She didn't answer directly. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to be staring through me, into something beyond. She began to recount her story, her voice a hollow, reedy whisper, punctuated by the frantic clicking of her rosary beads. It had started weeks ago, soft scratching noises emanating from her bedroom closet. At first, she dismissed it. A mouse. The house was old after all, but the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, a rhythmic scraping like claws on wood. Then came the marks, 6 feet up the interior closet door, long, deep gouges in the old pine, too high for any rodent, too deep for any cat, too deliberate. And then, the voices. They started as whispers, indistinguishable. Then they solidified, taking on a familiar cadence. Her late husband's gentle tone, calling her name, mocking her. "He's been gone 5 years, she whimpered, her voice cracking. "It wasn't him. It couldn't be. It was twisted." The banging started soon after. Violent, jarring blows from inside the closet, shaking the doors on their hinges, rattling the very walls of the farmhouse. She'd prayed. She'd barricaded the door. She'd even fired the shotgun, blasting 2 rounds into the solid wood, hoping to scare it, wound it, make it stop. It hadn't. It had only gotten louder, angrier. And then, last night, it had whispered again. Not her husband's voice, a new one. A raw, guttural whisper that had filled the house with an unholy resonance. Tonight, it had promised. Tonight, Eileen. The air in the room felt heavy, the oppressive silence punctuated only by the frantic clicking of Mrs. Garrity's rosary. My skin crawled. The story was absurd, the kind of deranged fantasy a person might conjure after too many lonely nights in an isolated farmhouse. But her fear was terrifyingly real, a tangible thing that permeated the dust-filled air. The details were too vivid, too unsettling to dismiss outright. My cynicism, usually a sturdy shield, felt thin, porous. I found myself remembering flashes of things I tried to forget, things that lurked at the edges of my own fragmented childhood memories. The smell of smoke and something else, something metallic and sweet, like blood and roses. The feeling of being watched, always watched, even when I was alone. "Mrs. Garrity," I said, forcing my voice to be calm, steady. "You need to get out of here, at least for the night." She looked at me then, really looked at me, a flicker of something like hope in her haunted eyes. "But it'll follow me." "We'll find you a safe place," I promised, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. There was no safe place. Not really. Not from things like this. But it was what she needed to hear. "Pack a bag, just a small one." She didn't argue. She just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, before slowly, stiffly, rising from the armchair. Every movement seemed to be a monumental effort. I watched her shuffle towards the hallway, her eyes still darting towards the bedroom, towards the closet with the shotgun blast in its door. It was the only time I'd seen someone move away from a threat with such a profound sense of resignation. She knew it was pointless, but she complied anyway, because it was the only option left. I waited outside while she gathered her things, the rain a steady tattoo on the metal roof. The world felt muted, eerily still, as if holding its breath. The distant croak of crows seemed to carry an unnatural weight, their calls sounding less like birds and more like omens. When she finally emerged, a small, worn valise clutched in her trembling hand, she looked even more frail, more terrified. I drove her to the only motel on the edge of town, a rundown two-story affair that smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarette smoke. It was the kind of place where dreams came to die, not where people sought refuge, but she didn't care. She clung to the key I handed her like a lifeline, her knuckles white. As I turned to leave, she offered a whispered, "Thank you, young man," her voice barely audible. The relief that washed over her face was palpable, profound. It was the face of someone who had just been given a temporary reprieve from a death sentence. It made my stomach clench. I knew, with a certainty born of bitter experience, that some things couldn't be outrun. As I pulled the county sedan away from the motel, the rain had stopped, leaving the night eerily silent. The few streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that danced with the occasional gusts of wind. My hand was on my watch again, checking the time that never seemed to move forward, only cycle back on itself, trapping me in an endless loop of dread. I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, something flickered in the window of Mrs. Garrity's room, a faint, flickering glow, a deep, pulsating red. My brow furrowed, and I glanced back again, gripping the steering wheel tighter. My breath hitched. Was it a reflection? The taillights of my own car? The motel sign? I kept driving, the image lingering, an unpleasant aftertaste in the back of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, but the little hairs on my neck were standing at attention, a familiar warning. I pushed it down. Deny, deny, deny. It was a coping mechanism, a terrible one, but all I had left. The chief's call came at 4 a.m., ripping me from a restless, dream-haunted sleep. The kind of sleep that wasn't really sleep at all, just a brief respite from the constant vigilance, peppered with flashes of an old house burning and a scream I couldn't quite remember. "Get to the motel. Now!" His voice was sharp, strained, carrying an urgency that sent a jolt of anxiety through me, a shock of cold dread that went straight to my marrow. He hadn't bothered with pleasantries. He knew I'd understand. And I did. My old boots hit the cold, linoleum floor with a thud. I was dressed and out the door in under 2 minutes. My go bag, always packed, always near the door, already slung over my shoulder. Some people had emergency kits for natural disasters. I had one for unnatural ones. When I arrived, the motel parking lot was a cacophony of flashing blue and red lights, painting the damp asphalt in a macabre disco. Yellow tape, stark against the drab motel exterior, already cordoned off Mrs. Garrity's room. A couple of actual sheriff's deputies stood outside, looking pale and ill. The chief was already there, his face a ghostly white under the flashing lights, his usual stoicism replaced with a flicker of raw, unadulterated fear. That was when I knew. This wasn't a lost dog or a prank call. This was the real deal. The kind of real deal that followed me like a shadow. I ducked under the tape, my stomach churning. Inside, chaos reigned. The air, already thick with the scent of mildew and stale smoke, was now overpowered by the coppery tang of blood. Fresh blood. So much of it, it painted the walls and ceiling in violent streaks, a gruesome, abstract masterpiece. The scent was nauseating, a mix of copper, fear, and decay that seemed to seep into my very skin, clinging to my clothes, my hair. Every breath felt heavy, as though the air itself was laden with an invisible, suffocating dread. The room carried a terrible, suffocating weight, as if the walls themselves were alive, closing in on us with silent menace. It was cold, unnaturally so. The kind of bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. It was a cold that vibrated with malevolence, an ancient, predatory cold that sank into my soul, making it hard to breathe. Deep, angry claw marks gouged the wooden furniture, the dresser, the nightstand, their splintered edges standing out starkly against the dark stains of blood. It looked like a wild animal had gone on a rampage, but there was no wild animal, just a terrified old woman. And then I saw it, the closet door. It stood ajar, casting a shadow that seemed unnaturally long and deep, a yawning maw of darkness. It was as though it led somewhere far more sinister than its modest dimensions should allow. And the room was empty. No body, no signs of a struggle beyond the grotesque scene, no overturned furniture, no broken glass beyond the mirror shards that might have already been there from the farmhouse. Just the blood and the overwhelming sense of malevolence that made every hair on my body stand on end. The door was locked from the inside, one of the deputies whispered, his voice barely audible, thick with disbelief. Chief checked it himself. The chief ran a trembling hand over his scalp, his gaze fixed on the blood-splattered wall, as if trying to decipher a terrible message. "What the hell happened here?" he muttered, more to himself than to us. He looked like an old man suddenly confronted with the existence of devils. He looked like I felt most days. My eyes, trained by years of unwilling observation, scanned the floor. 10 thin streaks, where fingers had clawed in desperation. The marks ended abruptly at the closet door. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum beat against the silence. The air around it felt even colder, heavier, charged with a malevolent energy that pressed down on me. I hesitated before peering inside, my hand on the mag light, though I knew it would be useless. The closet was empty, but the sense of something malevolent lingered, a thick, greasy film on the air. It felt like standing in the mouth of a hungry beast. We never found Mrs. Garrity. Her blood-streaked motel room became the stuff of local legend, a chilling reminder of her mysterious, impossible fate. The official report labeled it a missing persons case, leaving a neat, clinical explanation for something that defied all reason. But those of us who had been there, who had seen the claw marks and felt that soul-deep, biting cold, knew better. We knew it wasn't just cold, it was the kind of numbing, biting freeze that carried with it a sense of pure dread, a silent scream of ultimate terror. It was the scent of the void, and it clung to everything. Months later, the job long over. Garrity just another blurry, unpleasant memory in the rearview mirror of my nomadic life. I found myself passing through the area again. Stupid, I know, but the road called, and sometimes the road just loops back on itself. A grim curiosity, or perhaps my persistent, regrettable conscience, drew me back to the Garrity farmhouse. It was just as I remembered it, more dilapidated, more forlorn. The boards still covered the closets, a futile attempt to cage the darkness within. Shards of shattered mirrors still glinted on the floor, reflecting distorted images of the empty, dust-filled rooms. The silence was even deeper now, an ancient, knowing silence that filled the space where life had once been. I was in the living room, trying to make sense of the lingering wrongness, when my burner phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. Unknown caller. My breath hitched, a sudden, cold knot forming in my stomach. My pulse quickened, a frantic rabbit against my ribs. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Who could it be, and why now? My fingers hesitated over the accept button, trembling slightly. No one I knew had this number. No one. This was my throwaway line, my escape route. This was impossible. But then, that damn conscience, that fatal flaw, it whispered, "What if?" And I, like a fool, listened, summoning a courage I rarely felt. I finally swiped to answer. The line crackled with static, a familiar sound that always preceded bad news. And then, a voice. A whisper, dry and papery, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. A voice I knew, a voice that had haunted my waking thoughts and my nightmares for months. "It's not done with me, Mrs." Garrity whispered, her voice strangely disembodied, as if coming from a great distance, or perhaps from somewhere just behind me. "And it's coming for you next." The line went dead. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the buzzing silence. The silence of a dead line. The silence of a dead woman. The air in the farmhouse seemed to drop another 20 degrees, the unnatural cold prickling my skin. My eyes darted to the closest boarded closet door, then to the shattered mirrors, their distorted reflections seeming to mock me. Even now, years later, her voice echoes in my mind, a chilling whisper that refuses to fade. I'll never forget the sound of her terror, the resignation in her final words. And every time I hear a faint scratching in the walls of whatever cheap motel room I'm hiding in, or feel an unnatural chill settle over me, I wonder, I always wonder, is it here? Is it finally coming for me too? And what the hell am I going to do about it? My hand went to my watch again, checking the time. It was always time, and it was always running out. Total character count, 9942. The cold pre-dawn air tasted of pine and stale terror, a flavor I'd grown intimately familiar with over the years. My worn leather jacket, a second skin, did little to ward off the insidious chill that seeped into my bones. A cold born not of the Appalachian night, but of the things lurking just beyond the halo of the gas station's flickering fluorescent lights. My hand, rough and calloused, instinctively found the face of my old analog wristwatch, tracing the scarred glass with a thumb that still trembled faintly. The minute hand stood frozen, a testament to how long I'd been here, perched on the edge of a world I understood, staring into the impenetrable darkness of one I didn't. They were still there, of course, thousands of pinpricks of malevolent light, like a constellation of predators' eyes, fixed on me from the tree line. Silent, waiting. The forest breathed a stillness that screamed. It was dawn that was coming for me, not the night. It was dawn that would reveal the true horror. Hours earlier, the concept of horror had been a distant, abstract notion, something I read about in dog-eared paperbacks during long hauls. Back then, it was just the weariness of the road, the hum of the engine, and the endless pursuit of anonymity. I'd been running for longer than I cared to admit, drifting through towns and taking whatever night shifts or transient gigs would pay for gas and the next temporary bolt hole. This trip to the Appalachians was just another desperate attempt to outrun the echoes of a past I couldn't quite remember, but that clung to me like wet grave dirt. A small cabin, barely 500 square feet of weathered timber, advertised as a rustic retreat. To me, it was just a place to disappear. My go bag, perpetually packed with a change of clothes, a heavy mag light, protein bars, and a basic first aid kit, was always within reach. A relic from a different life, a constant reminder that I was always on the precipice of fleeing. My sidearm, a practical piece of steel, was a necessary evil. I wasn't a hero, never claimed to be, just a man who kept stumbling into nightmares. The drive itself had been interminable. 2 days of gray highways dissolving into narrow, winding mountain roads that hugged the sheer rock face like a nervous tick. The mountains themselves felt ancient, a mausoleum of rock and ice, silently judging every trespasser. By the evening of February 18th, the light was bleeding from the sky, painting the peaks in bruised purples and grays. My eyes burned, my shoulders ached, and the only thing I truly wanted was the dubious comfort of a bed that wasn't shaking beneath me. I finally pulled the beat-up pickup truck into the gravel patch beside the cabin, the tires crunching like hungry insects. The small structure loomed, a dark silhouette against the dying light, dwarfed by the towering pines. It was late, truly late, the kind of late where the world seems to hold its breath. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence was a punch to the gut, vast and unbroken, save for the distant, almost imperceptible hum of cicadas. My gaze drifted to the trunk, packed with what little I considered belongings. My bags, a cooler, a box of instant coffee. The thought of wrestling it all out, in the dark, with that oppressive silence pressing in, made my already frayed nerves fray further. "Fuck it," I muttered, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "If something's coming for me, it won't wait for my luggage." A typical Leo Vance sentiment. Cynical, fatalistic, and just lazy enough to be dangerous. I'd unpack in the morning. Famous last words, as it always turned out. I slammed the truck door shut, the sound oddly muffled by the dense forest. Each creaking step on the cabin's small porch echoed, not just into the immediate silence, but seemed to stretch into the black maw of the woods behind me. It was then I heard it. Click, 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 click. Faint, barely perceptible, like tiny pebbles shifting, or the dry scrape of bone on bone. It was too soft for an animal, too rhythmic for a natural sound. My head snapped around, my hand already dropping to the worn grip of the .45 on my hip, a reflex honed by too many nights spent on the edge of the unknown. Nothing. Just the dark, hulking mass of my parked truck. The clicking stopped the moment I turned. "Jesus Christ, I whispered, the words thin and reedy in the sudden, heavy silence. "I need sleep. I'm hearing things." It was the convenient lie, I told myself, the one that kept me from spiraling. But my heart was already doing a frantic jig against my ribs, a warning drumbeat that sleep wouldn't quiet. I unlocked the door, the tumbler protesting with a loud, metallic grating sound that made me wince. The interior of the cabin was a black void. I flicked on the light switch, a feeble bulb sputtering to life, casting sickly yellow light on dust motes dancing in the air. The place smelled of old wood, damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood or ozone. I flicked the light off, the darkness rushing back in, thick and immediate. This wasn't a place for bright lights. This was a place for shadows and secrets. I flopped onto the twin bed, still fully dressed, the denim of my jeans rasping against the coarse blanket. My mind, usually a buzzing hive of anxieties, was mercifully empty, consumed by sheer exhaustion. The last thing I remembered was the persistent, almost physical weight of the silence outside, pressing against the thin walls. Then, nothing. Just blackness. The scream ripped through the silence like a knife through silk. It was a woman's scream, high-pitched, raw, and utterly unequivocally terrified. It wasn't human, not really. It was something primal, a sound torn from the deepest wells of terror, full of agony and frantic desperation. My eyes snapped open, my body instantly rigid, every muscle taut. The adrenaline hit me like a train, washing away the lingering tendrils of sleep, leaving behind a cold, stark clarity. I lay there, stomach pressed against the thin mattress, the darkness absolute, listening, every second stretched into an eternity. My heart hammered, a frantic drum solo against my ribs. I could feel the blood thrumming in my ears, hot and fast. Thump, 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 thump. The air in the cabin, still and heavy, seemed to vibrate with the aftershocks of that sound. My breath caught in my throat, each exhalation a ragged gasp. I waited. And then it came again, a second scream, even more guttural, a sound that curdled the blood and froze the marrow. It was distant, yes, but not so distant that it could be ignored. Half a mile, perhaps, deep in the suffocating embrace of the forest. "Shit," I breathed, the word a plume of cold air in the blackness. "What the hell do I do?" The question hung in the air, mocking me. My first instinct, the one honed by years of running, was to grab my go bag, get in the truck, and burn rubber until the Appalachians were a faint smudge in the rearview mirror. But then that other instinct, the one I cursed and resented, the one I called my reluctant conscience, started to whisper. A woman, alone, terrified, maybe injured. It was a familiar tug, a responsibility I never asked for, a fatal flaw that consistently dragged me into the very heart of the things I spent my life trying to avoid. It was the same pull that had once made me look into a shadowed alley when I should have walked on by. The same pull that made me pick up stray dogs, even though I knew attachments were liabilities. I can't do nothing, I finally muttered, pushing myself up from the bed, the mattress groaning in protest. The .45 felt cold and heavy in my hand as I grabbed it from the nightstand, my fingers automatically checking the slide, the chamber. Pointless. Probably. Guns rarely helped against the things I encountered, but it was a comfort, a familiar weight. I moved with a speed born of desperation, stumbling through the dark cabin, not bothering to turn on the light. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every creak of the old wood floorboards sounded like a giant's footfalls. I burst out the front door, the cool night air washing over me, the scent of pine needles suddenly sharp and acrid. My eyes scanned the darkness for the familiar shape of my truck. It was then I saw it. The driver's side door, already ajar, swinging lazily in a non-existent breeze. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, twisted in my gut. My stomach plummeted. I fumbled for my phone, its weak beam slicing through the oppressive darkness. What I saw wasn't good. My truck, my sanctuary, had been violated. All four doors stood open, gaping like silent mouths. The trunk lid was propped up, revealing an empty space where my bags should have been. My survival essentials, gone. My spare ammo, gone. My first aid kit, gone. Panic, raw and visceral, began to claw its way up my throat. This wasn't just a robbery. This was a message. They didn't just want my stuff, they wanted me helpless. My sanctuary was breached. My safe haven was compromised. They had been here, inside my space, while I slept. The thought was nauseating. I scrambled into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the phone. The key was still in the ignition. A small mercy. I turned it, the engine sputtering, coughing, a dry, metallic rattle. It tried. Oh, it tried. But it refused to catch. Over and over, I cranked the ignition, the battery groaning, the engine wheezing its last. Each failed attempt was a hammer blow to my already fracturing composure. My breath hitched, my vision blurred. I slammed my fist down onto the horn, a long, mournful blast that ripped through the silence, a guttural scream of pure rage and helpless panic. No, damn it, no! And then, through the echoing reverberations of the horn, the screaming began again. Closer this time, more urgent. That terrible, raw sound of a woman in unimaginable terror. My fist dropped from the horn, the fury draining away, replaced by the relentless current of my unwanted conscience. She was still out there, and I was now effectively stranded. The car was dead. My gear was gone. My every instinct screamed to retreat, to curl into a ball, to disappear. But that scream, it dragged me forward. It dragged me right back to every helpless moment I'd ever witnessed. Every time I'd been unable to act, or had failed to. It was a siren song of self-reproach. I grabbed the heavy mag light from the glove compartment. One small victory, at least. Its beam, solid and bright, cut a path through the dark. Don't do this, Leo, I muttered to myself, even as my legs carried me towards the black maw of the forest. This is how you get yourself killed. Again. But I was already moving, already committing. This wasn't bravery. This was a fucked up sense of penance. For what felt like an eternity, I stumbled through the undergrowth, the mag light's beam cutting a lonely circle in the suffocating darkness. The ground was uneven, treacherous with tangled roots and slick leaves. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. And something else, something metallic and sharp, like static electricity or a butcher shop. I called out, my voice hoarse. "Hello! Is anyone there? Where are you?" Only the whispering of the wind through the pines answered me, mocking my futility. The screams, when they came, were my only guide. I pushed through dense thickets of rhododendron, their branches slapping at my face, snagging on my jacket. My lungs burned, my legs ached, each step a punishing effort. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees looming like silent, skeletal giants. An hour bled into 2, then 3. I was deep now, truly lost. And then, the scream, which had been pulling me deeper, suddenly shifted. It came from the opposite direction. My blood ran cold, my mind, already frayed, snagged on the impossible. How? I had been following the sound, steadily, relentlessly. It defied logic, a trick. They were playing with me. Panic, hot and cloying, began to rise again, suffocating me. I spun, disoriented, the maglite beam sweeping wildly through the trees. "No, no, no, no!" I gasped, fear making my voice a ragged croak. "Damn you!" I turned and started running, back the way I thought I'd come, back towards the cabin, back towards the source of the new, closer scream. Surely the injured woman had somehow made her way back. Surely I hadn't been led on a wild goose chase. But there was no cabin, only more trees, more darkness. And then the woods went dead silent. The cicadas, which had been a constant, low hum, vanished. The wind, which had whispered through the pines, died. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of unseen critters, all gone. The silence wasn't natural. It was a suffocating blanket, a void that pressed in on all sides, the kind of silence that precedes an ambush. It felt like the world had stopped breathing. My paranoia, always a low thrum beneath my cynicism, exploded into full-blown terror. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, and the blood rushed in my ears, roaring like a phantom ocean. I felt disoriented, not just by the physical act of being lost, but by a profound sense of wrongness that permeated the very air. My equilibrium felt off, like the ground was sloping subtly when it wasn't, or the air itself was shifting in invisible currents. In a flurry of raw panic, I swept the maglight's beam around, a desperate act to ward off the encroaching darkness. And that's when I saw them. Thousands of them. Eyes. They surrounded me, a shimmering, malevolent constellation in the blackness. Not just 2 or 4, but hundreds, thousands, stretching as far as the beam could reach. Green, yellow, red, some a sickly phosphorescent blue. They glowed with an unnatural light, not reflecting my flashlight but emanating from within, like burning embers. They were at eye level, high in the trees, low in the undergrowth. They were everywhere. My breath hitched. My mind, usually quick with a sarcastic quip, went utterly blank with primordial terror. This wasn't a lost hiker. This wasn't an animal. This was a legion. And the scream hadn't been a woman. It had been them, calling to me, luring me. My old ranger training, a fleeting thought, a distant memory from a time before the true horrors began, flickered through my mind. If your equilibrium is off, lean into it. But then the terrifying, chilling realization hit me. It wasn't my equilibrium. It was them. Whatever they were, their presence warped the very air, twisted reality. The woman, the scream, the chase. It was all a macabre game, a hunt, and I was the prey. A guttural sound, halfway between a sob and a curse, tore from my throat. I didn't think, I just ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, a desperate, blind scramble through the dense, unforgiving woods. Branches lashed at my face, roots tripped my feet, but I kept moving, powered by pure, unadulterated terror. Behind me, the sounds began, fleshy tapping. Not just one set of feet, but many, a horrifying, syncopated rhythm. The soft, wet thud of something heavy hitting the earth. The knocking of hooves, a sharp, cloven sound, irregular and too close. The smell of wild game, strong and musky, mixed with something else, something fetid and sweet. The flapping of wings, not the gentle beat of a bird, but a heavy, leathery rustle, like enormous membranes unfurling in the stagnant air, stirring the cold night. A sudden rush of displaced air, chilling my neck. They were all around me, a symphony of grotesque pursuit. I could hear them just beyond the reach of my maglite beam, felt their presence like a tangible pressure on my back. My lungs were on fire, each breath a searing gasp. My heart felt like a trapped bird, about to burst from my chest. I pushed harder, limbs screaming in protest, vision blurring with sweat and tears. I ran until the world dissolved into a smear of black and green, until every muscle shrieked, until I thought my heart would give out. And then, just as I felt myself swaying, about to collapse, a faint, impossible light pierced the darkness ahead. Streetlights, a single, glowing sign, a gas station, salvation, or at least a temporary reprieve. I burst out of the tree line, stumbling, gasping, my legs barely holding me upright. The transition from the absolute darkness of the forest to the harsh, artificial glare of the streetlights was jarring, blinding. I pivoted, spinning around, my hand instinctively going for the empty holster on my hip before remembering my weapon was useless, lost, or already forgotten. I raised the maglite, its powerful beam cutting through the night, sweeping across the edge of the forest from which I'd just emerged. They were there, the glowing eyes, thousands of them, sat at the tree line, a silent, unmoving audience. They didn't follow me out into the light, they just watched, silent, immobile. Their malevolence was palpable, a cold, hungry gaze that stripped me bare. They knew. They always knew. I backed up slowly, my gaze locked on the terrifying spectacle, until my back pressed against the cold metal of a gas pump. I slid down, collapsing onto the concrete, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. My chest burned, my throat was raw, but I couldn't look away. I just sat there, the maglite still clenched in my trembling hand, staring back at them. The eyes, unblinking, unwavering. An hour passed. 2. The cold seeped into my very bones, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I was a man on the edge, locked in a silent staring contest with a primordial horror, waiting for the sun, like a fragile, pathetic flower. The world slowly began to lighten, the black turning to bruised purple, then gray. With the first faint blush of dawn, the glowing eyes at the tree line began to fade, one by one like dying embers. By the time the sun finally crested the distant mountains, painting the world in a wash of pale, watery light, they were gone, completely. The forest returned to its natural, deceptive stillness. Just trees, just silence, nothing to see here. A beat-up pickup truck pulled into the gas station moments later, a cloud of exhaust puffing behind it. The owner, a sleepy-eyed man with a stained cap, stepped out, yawning. He took one look at me, slumped against the pump, covered in dirt and scratches, eyes wide and bloodshot, and probably figured I was a drunk who'd spent the night in a ditch. He was a familiar type. They always were. I managed to croak out a request for a ride to the nearest police station, the words tasting like ashes. He looked me over, his gaze lingering on my empty holster, then just shrugged. Long night? Huh? Buddy? At the station, the story was simple. Got lost hiking, Car broke down. Someone must have broken in and stripped it while I was gone. The cops, as always, just nodded, wrote it down. Another robbery in the backcountry, another tourist getting more than they bargained for. They didn't see the terror in my eyes, didn't hear the screams that still echoed in my skull. They never did. I called a friend, mumbling something about a misadventure, needing a ride home. Back in my own city, the air tasted cleaner, safer, but the memories clung like a shroud. I booked weekly therapy appointments, a cynical exercise I knew wouldn't truly help. I kept my mouth shut, to my friends, to my family, to everyone but the paid listener who wouldn't judge me, because they thought it was all just a symptom. They thought I'd been robbed, that I'd had a bad trip. They wouldn't believe me if I told them about the eyes, about the sounds of hooves and wings, about the scream that wasn't a woman's. They would have looked at me like I was insane. And maybe, just maybe, I was. I don't know what those things were. I don't know why the hell they were there, lurking in the primordial darkness of those mountains. I only know one thing. For your own safety, do not vacation to the Appalachians. Some places, some horrors, are best left undisturbed, and some experiences leave a mark that no amount of running can ever erase. It was just another mark on the ledger, another layer of scar tissue over the raw wound that was my past. The taste lingered on my tongue, metallic and strangely sweet, like a whisper of forbidden knowledge. Every bite had been a step closer to the abyss, and now, the flickering television screen in the motel room blared the headline, painting the horror in stark, undeniable strokes. Missing family of 3. My stomach clenched, not with revulsion, but with a horrifying, self-loathing recognition. A cold, insidious truth was settling in my gut, one that made me want to claw my own skin off. It was the same taste, the same sick, guilty pleasure that whispered of unspeakable things. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to erase the image of the smiling man with blood on his hands. But his voice echoed in the hollow space behind my eyelids, offering mystery meatloaf. The words were a vile, culinary punchline, and I was the unwitting, complicit guest at the table. It had all started, as these things always do, with a perfectly normal, annoyingly persistent friend, a ridiculously cheap menu, and the deceptive scent of grease and false promise, pulling me into yet another corner of this twisted map I seemed fated to walk. The small town in Missouri was exactly the kind of place I usually went out of my way to avoid. Too many eyes, too many familiar faces, too many opportunities for the past to catch up or for new horrors to manifest. I preferred the anonymity of highways and rest stops, the transient nature of a life lived between truck stops and dilapidated motels. But my current gig, a graveyard shift at a distribution warehouse on the outskirts of town, had me stuck for the foreseeable future. A temporary prison, I told myself, just until the next payroll cleared and I could point the old pickup towards another horizon. The town itself was a postcard of American folksiness. All clapboard houses and the scent of pine needles from the nearby national park. People knew each other's names, or so it seemed, waving from porch swings and pickup trucks. It was the kind of community that made my skin crawl. Tight-knit usually meant too close for comfort, too many secrets buried beneath that manicured lawn of normalcy. Then, Sam's Smash Burgers and More showed up. A new joint, opened by some tourist who decided to plant roots. The talk around the warehouse break room was all about it, mostly positive, sprinkled with a few unsettling whispers. Weird taste. Found a hair. Thought I saw a ring. I'd heard it all before, the usual gripes about any new establishment. But then someone mentioned a tooth, a human molar, supposedly. That got my attention, not because I believed it, but because it had the distinct tang of the truly improbable, the kind of story that usually presaged a much nastier reality. The owner, Sam, a perpetually smiling man, had apparently dismissed it all as a conspiracy by the locals to keep outsiders out. A notion so ludicrous it almost looped back around to believable. Almost. Come on, Leo, man. You gotta try it, Trey insisted, practically vibrating with enthusiasm. Trey was another reason I was stuck here. He was my shift supervisor, a genuinely good guy who had taken a shine to me, despite my best efforts to remain a polite, professional enigma. He kept pushing, kept badgering, rattling off how amazing the food was. Seriously, dude, 15 times already, and I've never found anything weird. Sam's a good guy. He clasped his hands together in mock prayer, his eyes wide. I stared at him, my gaze lingering a moment too long on his friendly, open face. A cold sliver of memory snaked through me. The easy trust I'd once placed in a familiar face, only to find a hollow, monstrous imitation beneath. Mitch. Goddamn Mitch. The paranoia was a constant companion now, a low hum beneath the surface of my consciousness. It flared brightest when someone was too nice, too insistent. 15 times, I echoed, the words tasting like ash. You're either an idiot savant for cheap eats, or you've developed an iron constitution for local legends. Trey laughed, oblivious, and for a second, I felt a pang of something akin to guilt for my dark thoughts. He was just a regular guy. Probably. Okay. I relented, a sigh escaping me that tasted of resignation. Fine, but only to shut you up. And if I find a toenail in my fries, I'm blaming you. We shared a strained laugh, mine more of a grimace, and headed out. Buster was back at the motel. Thank God. No way I was dragging him into another potential nightmare. He was probably curled up on the passenger seat of the truck, waiting for me to emerge from another one of my self-inflicted detours into the bizarre. My worn leather jacket felt heavier than usual, a familiar comfort and a constant reminder of the burdens I carried. I checked my analog wristwatch, more out of habit than need, the second hand sweeping its eternal, indifferent arc. 5:10. Time meant nothing when you were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sam's smash burgers and more was something. From the outside, it looked like a repurposed roadside diner from the 70s, with a few sun-bleached picnic tables out front. The umbrellas faded like old bruises. Inside, it was clear what it had been: a laundromat, a brightly lit, slightly too clean laundromat, with a walled-off kitchen section where the massive commercial dryers once stood. The lingering scent of fabric softener was doing battle with the smell of sizzling grease, creating a bizarre olfactory cocktail. Laundry and burger, I muttered, shaking my head. Only in America. Trey, meanwhile, was already at the counter, beaming at the menu tacked up behind the register. It was short, a sparse list of classics: single, double, triple cheeseburgers, pork steak, house fries, fried pickles, and chili. Everything was listed at a shocking $2. $2. My cynical alarm bells started ringing like a fire truck. Nothing was that cheap without a catch. Nothing. The only things that came free in my world were pain and regret. This price felt like a challenge, an insult to the laws of economics, a blatant red flag fluttering in a non-existent breeze. You go first, I told Trey, my stomach rumbling in protest against my unease. My appetite had a nasty habit of ignoring my brain's warnings. He ordered a double cheeseburger, house fries, and a fried pickle. Fried? A pickle? I managed, my brow furrowing. My brain was still trying to compute the economics of $2 everything. Yo, Leo, wake up, man. Stop spacing out, weirdo. Trey laughed, lightly grabbing my shoulder. I flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the touch. My eyes narrowed, scanning his face for any tell, any flicker of something else. Nothing. Just Trey, good old oblivious Trey, my self-preservation instinct, honed by years of running from unseen things, was a nagging buzz in my skull. I felt like prey in a field of flowers, every petal a potential trap. I forced my attention back to the menu. $2 for anything. It screamed desperate or too good to be true, or both. My gaze lingered on the chili and fries. Can I get the chili and the fries? I asked, my voice a little rougher than I intended. Like, can you combine the two to make chili fries? The man behind the counter, Sam, was an older guy, maybe early 60s, with a round, pleasant face and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His grin was wide, almost unnaturally so, like a mask that had been stretched too far. It brought a shiver down my spine, a faint echo of the chilling artistry I'd witnessed in that pristine, antique-filled house where beauty was just a mask for decay. Olivia, her house had been a meticulously curated tableau, just like this man's smile felt curated. Certainly, Sam boomed, his voice ridiculously ebullient. It'll be about 30 minutes, okay? We make everything fresh and hot. 30 minutes. For chili fries. It was a long time for a fast food joint, but if everything was indeed fresh, I nodded. Trey nodded, and we found a booth. The booths were red vinyl, worn smooth in patches, probably from decades of restless laundromat patrons. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a clinical glow on the already sterile-looking interior. We hadn't been sitting for long when the smell hit us. Not just the faint, battling odors of fabric softener and old grease. This was something else, a richer, deeper, more primal aroma. The scent of frying meat, yes, but also something earthy, almost gamey. It was intoxicating. A heavy, musky cloud that seemed to bypass my nose and go straight for some ancient lizard brain part of me. It instantly brought back a flood of half-formed memories, sensations more than images. A warmth, a feeling of security, a deep animal satisfaction. My mind, ever the masochist, immediately conjured a phantom ache, a memory of a time before the world went sideways. My father, a man I hadn't thought about in years, not willingly. He'd cooked, sometimes, big, hearty meals. I remembered the smile, broad and genuine, as he'd served up plates, my mother with her cheap camera, snapping photos. He dreamed of his own restaurant, a vision that had evaporated when the bank denied his loan. Then had come the bottles, the depression, the quiet house turning into a war zone, the fear that coiled in my gut every time I heard his heavy footsteps, the car wreck, the screaming, my mother kicking him out, the silence that followed, both blessed and damning. The universe, I reflected, was just a series of bad deals, one after another. No matter how good something smelled or felt, the price was always astronomical. 45 minutes later, not 30, a woman appeared, carrying our plates. She was young, maybe our age, with a perpetually tired expression that reminded me of my own face in the mirror most mornings. She placed the plates in front of us, and I found myself staring. The food looked artful. No, artful wasn't right. It looked perfect. The kind of perfect that felt wrong, like it had been designed by a surgeon, not a short-order cook. Every fry was placed with deliberate precision, every dollop of chili a miniature peak on a mountain range of golden potato. The cheese was melted exactly right, a shimmering blanket. It was immaculate, almost disturbingly so. "You see, bro, don't that shit look good?" Trey exclaimed, practically drooling. He lifted his burger, the cheese pulling in molten strings, the patties perfectly smashed, glistening with juice. The bun, too, was buttery, fluffy, with just the right amount of onion and lettuce peeking out. He was right. It looked impossibly good. Almost too good, like a prop in a horror movie, designed to lull the unsuspecting victim. The smile on Sam's face, wide and too bright, brought me back to Ethan, that charmer in the woods, whose appetites were far more particular than anyone could have guessed. He'd seemed so normal. This place felt the same. My chili fries were steaming, radiating a comforting warmth. The chili was thick, almost meaty, coating the fries perfectly. The fries themselves, despite being submerged in the concoction, were still stiff, crunchy on the outside, with soft, creamy potato on the inside. They were clearly hand-cut, thick and irregular, and coated in a seasoning that I couldn't quite place, familiar, yet alien. It prickled at the back of my throat, a subtle, addictive hum. I took a bite, then another, and another. The cascade of flavors was immediate, overwhelming, distracting. It was savory, rich, deeply umami, with a subtle sweetness that I couldn't pinpoint. My brain, usually a fortress of cynicism and paranoia, simply melted under the onslaught. It was delicious, horrifyingly, addictively delicious. For $2, the sheer absurdity of it should have been a red flashing light, but my senses were hijacked. I ate, shoveling the chili fries into my mouth, barely registering Trey's delighted slurping across from me. It was a compulsion, a need, a deep animal satisfaction that bordered on primal. The plate was almost empty before I even realized it. "Ha ha, told you this place is the best in town," Trey said, his mouth half full. "Yeah, no kidding," I mumbled, my voice thick. "This place, it's something else. The way the food was made, plated, immaculate. I'd believe it if this guy was a Michelin star chef." Trey just grinned. "I don't know who Michelin is or why their stars matter, but this food is bussin'." He said it with unearned confidence, perfectly unironically, and for a moment, I almost laughed. Almost, but then the food hit me, a wave of post-meal lethargy and a strange, almost shameful satisfaction. It was like I'd just eaten something I shouldn't have, something forbidden. We finished, pushing the empty plates across the table. When we stood to return them to the counter, that's when I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible beneath the low hum of the laundromat dryers and the clatter from the kitchen. A muffled cry, like someone was trying to yell, but their voice was swallowed by something thick, heavy, a plea, a choked gasp. My blood ran cold. The comfortable haze from the food evaporated, replaced by a sudden, brutal clarity. My ears strained, trying to isolate the sound, to make sense of it. The desperate, muffled sounds from the kitchen clawed at the edges of my hearing, a familiar echo of that cold, dead whisper on the mountain pass, or the pleas I'd heard from behind sealed doors. The kind of sound that meant someone was in trouble, the kind of sound I usually ran from. My stomach nodded. Damn that reluctant conscience of mine. "Hey, bro," I asked Trey, my voice low, barely a whisper. My hand went to my wrist, my fingers tracing the cold metal of my watch, a grounding tick. "Do you hear that? It sounds like someone trying to yell." Trey paused, his brow furrowed. He tilted his head, listening, then he shrugged, dismissing it. "Nah, I don't hear a thing. I think you're just crazy, 'cause I was right. And you're trying to find something wrong with this place." He laughed, a short, snickering sound. The kind of sound normal people made when faced with something abnormal. The kind of sound that made me want to scream. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. That I was just crazy. That my brain, perpetually haunted, was manufacturing horrors where none existed. It was easier to think that. It always was. Why would anyone risk this? Risk everything. For a $2 burger joint? The thought was too insane. Too monstrous. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the clinging dread. "Let's just go," I said, my voice flat. My go bag, always packed in the truck, suddenly felt miles away, unreachable. As we reached the door, Sam, the owner, emerged from the kitchen. He was smiling again, that same too wide, stretched smile, but this time, something else was evident. His hand, as he waved us out, was covered in blood. Not just a smear, but a wet, glistening coat. Too much. Far too much for a normal kitchen accident. The smell of something metallic, coppery, distinct from the grease, wafted from him. It made my gorge rise. "Come back later for our mystery meatloaf." "Waikiki," he called out, his voice booming with exaggerated cheer. A macabre joke that only he seemed to understand. A cold shiver, colder than any winter wind, ran down my spine. This wasn't a joke. This was a statement. The metallic tang, the unsettling sweetness of the food, the muffled screams, the too cheap prices, the missing tooth, the bloody hand. It all clicked into place with horrifying, sickening clarity. Another farm, another harvest, just a different kind of meat, same indifferent cosmic butchers. The thought chilled me to the bone, not just because of the gruesome implication, but because it resonated with a deeper, more profound dread, a chilling echo of that impossible, boundless farm I'd glimpsed in my worst moments, where existence itself felt like nothing more than a carefully curated feeding ground for unspeakable things. I mumbled a goodbye, my voice catching in my throat, and practically dragged Trey out the door. My eyes scanned the street, searching for anything, anyone, but the world outside felt just as oblivious as Trey. This town, like so many others, was just a stage for the everyday monstrous. Last night, curled on the lumpy mattress in my motel room, I watched the local news. My stomach was still a churning knot of unease, my mind replaying the image of Sam's bloody hand, the echo of those muffled cries. The local news anchor, her face grim, reported, "A vacationing family of 3 went missing earlier this week in our little town. Their car was found at the junkyard with nothing but bloodstains inside it. If you have any information, please call our helpline." My gaze drifted from the TV screen to the empty food container on the bedside table. My chili fries, the sickeningly delicious $2 chili fries. The taste, the weird, addictive, unforgettable taste. I felt sick, bone deep, soul sick. My hands started to tremble. I closed my eyes, trying to force the question from my mind, but it hammered against the inside of my skull, a relentless, horrifying drumbeat. Am I crazy, or does human meat actually taste good? The thought was a venomous serpent coiling in my gut, leaving a trail of ash and self-loathing. I refused to go back to that restaurant. I had to refuse, but a part of me, a dark, primal, disgusted part, knew the answer to that question, and it was the most horrifying truth of all. My knuckles screamed, a symphony of bone and gristle, as Marcus's head bounced off the cold, hard steps. The gurgling sound from his throat was a lullaby to the madness that had consumed me, a madness I thought was fueled by love, by fear, by a twisted sense of obligation. My own blood, hot and metallic, mixed with his on my fists, painting a gruesome portrait on the scuffed linoleum. The metallic tang of fear and something acrid, almost like ozone, filled the air. I kept hitting, a frantic, desperate rhythm, my mind a broken record of her voice, her threats, her impossibly demanding gaze. "Is this what you want, Lindsay?" I roared, my voice raw, cracking. But as the first teacher burst into the stairwell, eyes wide with horror, I saw only empty space where Lindsay should have been. Just me, Marcus's broken body, the blood, and the echoes of a voice that was never real. It's funny how a single wrong turn, a single stupid decision, can redefine your entire universe. Looking back, it had all started months earlier, with the screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal, a sound that would forever be etched into the raw, exposed nerve of my memory. A sound that, even now, years later, could still drag me back to the shredded upholstery, the smell of burning oil, and the impossible silence that followed. I've seen more than my share of impossible things since then. The cold, desolate road where a dead man whispered. The haunted house where the very walls bled secrets. The eyes of a creature that wore another man's face. But nothing. Not even the nightmare of heaven as a farm for cosmic predators. Quite scraped at the primal fear, like the memory of that night, when I was just a kid, believing I was in control. My analog wristwatch, a relic I still wear, was smashed then, its hands frozen at midnight, a permanent monument to where my life splintered. Most teens do stupid things. I was no exception. My particular brand of idiocy, however, came with a lifetime warranty of regret. It manifested as 8 beers, a borrowed '69 Camaro, and a misplaced sense of immortality. My dad loved that car more than he loved me. Probably. He should never have put that much faith in an 18-year-old idiot. Especially not that idiot. That version of me, who thought he could outrun physics and the consequences of a few too many Coors Lights. We were on our way back from junior prom. Lindsay beside me, her dress, a shimmering cascade of rose gold, still smelling faintly of cheap corsage in desperation. One moment, we were laughing, the radio spitting out some forgotten pop anthem. The next, the world exploded into a kaleidoscope of metal, glass, and a sickening, gut-wrenching spin. The black leather of my jacket, new then, but now a second skin of worn comfort, offered no protection. The crash itself is still a blur, a series of flash frames burned into the back of my eyelids. The shriek of tires, the impossible momentum, the gut-lurching impact that slammed me against the seatbelt, the windshield shattering into a spiderweb of death. Then, the silence. A silence so profound it felt like the world had simply stopped breathing. I remember the sickly sweet smell of coolant, the acrid bite of deployed airbags, and the horrifying wet warmth spreading across Lindsay's rose gold dress. Blood. So much blood. Hers, I realized, or maybe mine. The sight of it, blooming across the delicate fabric, was too much. The world swam, then vanished. Fear, or maybe just blood loss, dragged me into a void. I often wonder now if that was the moment it started, the fracturing, the moment the seams of my reality began to fray, leaving me open to whatever horrors were waiting in the wings. The sirens tore through the void first, a wailing banshee song, then the lights, strobing and blinding, even through my closed eyelids. The frantic, shouting voices of police and paramedics, distant and distorted, like trying to listen through a foot of water. They tore us from the mangled wreckage of what had been my father's pride and joy, tossed us into separate ambulances like discarded luggage. The last thing I remembered, before the blessed darkness claimed me again, was the cold, sterile mask over my nose and mouth, the instant wave of chemical-induced exhaustion washing over me. A familiar sensation now, the forced oblivion, a temporary reprieve from the relentless haunting. Waking up was a shock. The hospital room was sterile, silent, and empty. A dim fluorescent light hummed above my head, casting long, distorted shadows, and the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of a heart rate monitor was the only sign of life. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. Where was Lindsay, my parents, nurses? Why was I alone? I tried to sit up, a monumental effort that left me gasping, every muscle screaming in protest. And then, a horrific, impossible sensation. My left leg from the knee down was simply gone. A phantom limb, an echo of thought as I tried to flex a foot that no longer existed. The reality of it was a punch to the gut, a visceral understanding of how utterly, irrevocably broken I was. Just as the terror threatened to consume me whole, a nurse burst through the door, her face a mask of practiced calm. She hurried to my side, her voice soothing, telling me to relax, that I'd been in a coma for 3 days. 3 days. 3 days of nothingness. I knew what death felt like then, the sensation of absence, of being on the precipice of something vast and unforgiving. The realization of how close I'd come, How much I'd lost brought a fresh wave of tears. This feeling, this chilling touch of the void, would become a recurring companion in the years to come. My parents arrived shortly after, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. My mother, eyes red-rimmed, clung to me, a desperate embrace, as if to physically anchor me to the world of the living. My father, usually stoic, choked back tears, his gratitude for my survival palpable. The shower of love was overwhelming, a strange, warm balm after the cold. 3-day black spot in my life. It was nice, I had to admit, to be held, to be cared for, even by people who must have been secretly furious with me. But the nagging question, a persistent fly buzzing in my mind, wouldn't let me rest. "Where's Lindsay?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Once, then twice, the desperation growing with each syllable. My mother's face crumbled, tears streaming down her cheeks as she delivered the blow. "She's real banged up, honey. The doctors say she has significant brain damage. I'm so sorry." She dissolved into full-blown sobs, my father taking over, explaining how grateful he was that I was alive, how lucky I was. But all I could hear was brain damage. Lindsay, the girl I loved. What kind of brain damage? The words echoed in the sterile silence, a cruel, mocking whisper. I was terrified for her and disgusted with myself. The guilt, a crushing weight, settled deep in my chest, a phantom ache worse than my missing leg. This was the first brick in the wall of my fatal flaw, that accursed sense of responsibility that would always pull me back into the jaws of the abyss. A week blurred into the next, a haze of pain meds, physical therapy, and the bewildering process of learning to navigate a world that felt alien. I was getting used to the unsettling feel of my new prosthetic shin, a gleaming, cold piece of plastic and metal that was supposed to replace the flesh and bone that was no longer there. The idea that a part of me, a fundamental part of my body, simply ceased to exist was profoundly unsettling. It was a constant, chilling reminder of my own fragility and the permanence of my mistakes. Finally, and the day came when I was allowed to see Lindsay. She walked into my room, hesitant, almost timid, her movements stiff. The nurses allowed us a brief, supervised moment. I tried to speak to her, my voice gentle, full of the tenderness I felt, but she just seemed afraid of me, her eyes wide, wary. It was devastating, a fresh wound on my already raw soul. She simply managed a quiet, "Hello," and that was the extent of our conversation. I cried for hours that night, the humiliation and grief a bitter cocktail in my throat. I checked my wristwatch, a habit already forming, though it remained frozen, a useless symbol of shattered time. Weeks continued their slow, painful crawl, my speech therapy sessions, my attempts to relearn how to walk without falling, the awkward conversations with my parents about college applications that suddenly felt impossibly far away. Lindsay, meanwhile, was slowly recovering. Her speech, once slurred and hesitant, was gradually returning to normal, though still punctuated by a strange, almost artificial cadence. She told me about the endless hours of speech classes, the frustration of trying to force her tongue and brain to work together again. But even as her words flowed more freely, something felt off. Her personality. It wasn't the same girl I knew. We ate lunch together almost every day in the cafeteria, a ritual born of my lingering guilt and her quiet presence. Her tastes in food had undergone a bizarre revolution. She used to gag at the sight of broccoli. Now she devoured it, a strange, primal hunger in her eyes. Even her musical preferences, once a shared landscape of indie rock and pop, had dramatically shifted to some form of obscure, chanting folk music I couldn't stand. It pained me, a dull, constant throb, to witness how profoundly my reckless actions had warped her life, twisting her into someone unrecognizable. I became engrossed in her, more than ever before. It wasn't love anymore, Not in the innocent way it had been before. It was obligation, a desperate need to atone. I felt I owed her everything, that I needed to be there for her, no matter what twisted form her recovery took. Whatever she wanted, whatever she needed. I told myself I wouldn't hesitate. We spent every spare moment together, me trying desperately to rebuild the shattered connections, to find the ghost of the girl I used to know. It was hard, so incredibly hard. I was trying to find the old her for a long, painful time before the crushing realization hit me. She wasn't all there. A large portion of her old self remained, a familiar echo, but the missing pieces were glaring, leaving a void that was filled with something else, something alien. My wristwatch, a constant, comforting weight, ticked on my wrist, though its hand still hadn't moved. A small, irrational part of me wondered if the time had stopped for her too, in some unseen dimension. Over the next few months, I grew alarmingly committed to this new, strange version of our relationship. I was, I suppose, trying to fall in love with the person she had become. This new and improved Lindsay, as she sometimes sarcastically called herself. The strangest thing was her memory. She still remembered intimate details of our shared past. The corny pet names we'd invented, the specific, slightly embarrassing sexual fetishes we'd explored. It was like communicating with 75% of my beloved girlfriend, while the other 25% was a wild, unpredictable stranger, surprising me in sometimes unfortunate, sometimes terrifying ways. Her sudden, absolute blind faith in Christianity, for instance, was jarring. 8 months prior, we had both been cynical, critical skeptics, dissecting every organized religion with the sharp wit of intelligent, rebellious teenagers. Now, she spoke of divine intervention and judgment with an unsettling zeal. Needless to say, we didn't talk about religion much. It invariably dissolved into a bitter, shouting match. Her anger, a new and unsettling facet of her personality, was a storm that gathered quickly and broke with terrifying force. I was now in my senior year of high school, a year that, according to every movie and every older sibling, was supposed to be the peak of my carefree youth. Instead, I was consumed by the needs of my impaired and increasingly demanding girlfriend. My friends, the ones who hadn't drifted away after the accident, eventually gave up on me. I devoted most of my time and energy to Lindsay, becoming a shadow of my former self. The constant demands, the emotional roller coaster, the sheer effort of navigating her new personality. It was exhausting. She was becoming high maintenance to an unbearable degree. And to my surprise, I found myself starting to resent it, to get sick of it. The thought, even the flicker of it, filled me with a fresh wave of guilt. How could I feel this way about someone I had hurt so badly? But the resentment grew, a slow-spreading poison. When I finally, tentatively, tried to broach the subject, perhaps suggesting we spend a little less time together, that I needed some space, it escalated into a full-blown fight, a screaming match that echoed in the empty halls of my mind long after it ended. And then came the threat. "If you leave me," she hissed, her eyes blazing with an unsettling intensity I hadn't seen before, "I'll kill myself." It truly frightened me. Lindsay never talked that way, ever. The words hung in the air, heavy and dark, and I was really, truly starting to wonder how much the accident had warped her. I couldn't deal with the stress, the crushing weight of imagining her death on my conscience, piled on top of everything else. So now, like a fool, I stayed. My wristwatch, though broken, felt like a tether to a sanity I was quickly losing. Our relationship, by the end of senior year, had become a toxic feedback loop, a vicious cycle of anger, emotional abuse, frantic, desperate sex, and fleeting moments of strained forgiveness. She hated it, absolutely hated it, if I ever dared to bring up the accident or how it had changed her, or if I called her out on any of her new, increasingly erratic habits. Her new personality possessed a steaming temper, one that genuinely scared me at times. She still threatened to kill herself, and even more frighteningly, she began to threaten me. Her words, delivered with a chilling conviction, seemed to hold more and more truth with each passing day. The air around her sometimes felt thick, charged, like before a storm or before something unseen made itself known. I had come to recognize that feeling in later years, the precursor to true horror. I remember one evening, the air heavy with unspoken threats. I looked at her, truly looked at the stranger in front of me, and asked, "What do I need to do, Lindsay? What do I need to do to prove to you that I love you?" Her response, delivered with a chillingly calm certainty, chilled me to the bone. She told me that if I truly loved her, I would beat up her ex-boyfriend, Marcus, in school the next day. Again, she threatened to kill herself if I didn't do it. At this point, I was truly worried. The threats, the demands, the sheer irrationality of it all. It was too much. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I had to talk to her parents. I hadn't spoken to her mom or dad since the accident. They truly hated me for what I had done to their daughter, and I couldn't blame them. But this was different. This was beyond the scope of a ruined car and a damaged brain. This was about Lindsay's life, and perhaps mine. After she left for lacrosse practice that night, her absence a temporary, fragile relief, I took a walk to her house. The late afternoon air was crisp, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant exhaust fumes. I knocked on the door, a tentative rap that felt impossibly loud in the quiet neighborhood. No one answered. I knocked again, harder, the hollow sound echoing back at me. Still nothing. Finally, with a rising sense of desperation, I twisted the handle, unlocked. I pushed the door open a crack and peeked my head inside, calling out for her parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes? It's Leo." Her dad appeared almost instantly, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "What the fuck are you doing here?" he cursed, his voice low and dangerous. "Listen," I pleaded, my voice thin. "First off, I owe you a long overdue apology, but I need to talk about Lindsay. She's..." I was cut off as the door slammed in my face, the sound of final, definitive rejection. I stood there, stunned, the cold wood pressing against my nose. I banged on the door a few more times, shouting, trying to explain that I was worried, that she wasn't herself. There was no response, just the deafening silence of a family's hatred. The leather of my jacket felt heavy, a burden rather than a comfort. My wristwatch, perpetually stuck, mocked me. I went home that night, a cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. The next day, the threat of Marcus, of Lindsay, of myself. It hung over me like a suffocating shroud. Morning came, gray and indifferent, and I regretfully walked to school, each step a leaden weight. By midday, I had seen Lindsay a few times in the hallway, her eyes following me, a question in their depths. Her expression was unreadable, a blend of expectation and something colder. Finally, during a brief passing period, we stopped and spoke. Her voice, flat and uninflected, instructed me to meet her by the stairwell after lunch. The stairwell? The seldom used, forgotten passage in the older wing of the school, usually only frequented by delinquents and maintenance staff. A chill traced its way down my spine. I knew with a sickening certainty what was coming. So I did. After lunch, my stomach churning with anxiety, I made my way to the stairwell. The air in the stairwell was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and disinfectant. Lindsay was already there, leaning against the cold concrete wall, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She looked expectant. My hand went to my wristwatch, an unconscious tick, tracing the shattered glass. "So," she said, her voice a low murmur that seemed to fill the confined space. "Are you going to do it? Lindsay, no." My voice was firmer than I expected, a last stand against the encroaching madness. I'm not going to beat the shit out of Marcus just to prove that I love you. Why are you trying to make me do this? I argued, my frustration boiling over. Her smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. You can't even do one little thing I ask you to do? When did you become such a pussy? She resorted to her usual name-calling, a verbal lash that had become sickeningly familiar. It's not one little thing, Lindsay, I countered, my voice rising in volume, echoing off the concrete. You're asking me to assault your ex-boyfriend just to prove a point that I care about you. That's fucked up. Lindsay, and I'm not playing your mind games anymore. I stood my ground, my heart hammering against my ribs, a desperate defiance. She gritted her teeth, her jaw clenching as I refused to bend to her will. Her eyes, usually a soft hazel, seemed to darken, to become bottomless pits. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that made my blood run cold, she reached into her backpack. My breath hitched. She pulled out a small, mowing, gleaming utility knife, its blade wickedly sharp, catching the meager light from the stairwell window. She pressed the point of it, casually, against the tender skin of her wrist. Lindsay, stop! I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, raw with terror. I'll do it right here, she threatened, her voice a flat monotone, devoid of emotion. I'll bleed myself dry if you don't fuck him up when he comes up these stairs when the bell rings. The words hung in the stale air, punctuated by the faint, distant hum of the school, the indifferent world outside. I swallowed, a dry, painful gulp, terrified on multiple levels. I stood rooted to the spot. We sat there, the silence punctuated only by my ragged breathing and the distant school sounds, moments stretching into an eternity. I tried to reason with her, to explain how irrational she was being, how this wasn't the answer, but she only pressed the blade harder against her skin, a tiny bead of crimson welling up. The horror, the absolute bone-deep horror of what she might do, what I might be forced to witness, choked me. I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I had no other choice. She was truly going to do it. The thought of leaving, of running to tell someone, flashed through my mind. But I was sure she would make good on her threat if I even so much as flinched. The weight of her life, and my guilt, pressed down on me, forcing me into a decision I knew I would regret. Finally, the bell shrilled, its harsh sound echoing through the stairwell, signaling the end of lunch, the moment of truth. I looked at her once more, my eyes pleading, trying to articulate, one last time, why this was pointless, why it was so utterly messed up for her to be doing this. But my words died in my throat, swallowed by the rising tide of panic. I didn't know if I could handle seeing her slit her wrist in front of me, the memory of her prom dress, slick with blood, flashing through my mind. In that brief, agonizing moment, Marcus came slowly up the steps, his backpack slung over one shoulder, probably lost in thought about some video game or homework. He glanced at me, gave me a strange, questioning look, a frown creasing his brow. Hey, Mark, I said, my voice timid, barely a whisper. I couldn't do it. My fists, already bruised from a lifetime of other people's mistakes, clenched uselessly at my sides. He started to walk past me, his casual movement a stark contrast to the maelstrom in my gut. And then I heard it, Lindsay's scream. Do it! It was a shriek, primal and guttural, that ripped through the quiet stairwell. My eyes snapped to her. I saw it then, a drop of bright, shocking red blood, blossoming on her arm, just below the delicate pulse point, where the blade had hardly broken her skin. That was it. That was the moment something in me snapped. The world narrowed to Marcus. Rage, fear, guilt, a lifetime of suppressed trauma, it all converged into a single, explosive point. I slammed Marcus by his neck to the ground, his head thumping sickeningly against a concrete stair. He groaned, a pained, winded sound from the harsh impact. And then I was on him, a roaring animal. My fists became weapons, a blur of motion. His head bounced off the ground again and again, a grotesque drumbeat to my madness. My knuckles connected with his face, the satisfying crack of bone and cartilage, the warm, wet rush of blood. "Is this what you fucking want?" I screamed, my voice ragged, raw, as my fist connected, cracking his nose, collapsing his eye socket. I didn't stop. I continued until he was hardly breathing, his face a pulpy, unrecognizable mask drenched in his own blood, his throat gurgling a desperate plea for air. A small, rational part of my brain, a part I barely recognized, whispered about the consequences, but it was drowned out by the roar of the red mist. Moments later, the shouts began. Numerous people, teachers, students, their faces a mixture of horror and shock, surrounded us. Strong hands, too many to count, tore me to my feet, dragging me down the hall, away from the carnage. I struggled, still consumed by the primal urge to hit, to punish. I vaguely registered a flash of rose gold fabric, a fleeting glimpse of Lindsay's form. She fled, just like that. She melted into the frantic crowd, fearing she would get into trouble as well, as she should. I sat in the principal's office for what felt like hours, the fluorescent lights buzzing mockingly above my head, the smell of disinfectant clinging to my blood-stained hands. Principal Thompson, a man who had, for years, given me an inexplicable amount of leeway, his face a mask of disappointment and cold fury, paced back and forth. He told me he'd given me enough slack, that I'd gone way too far this time, that there would be severe consequences. I tried to explain, to articulate the nightmare I had been living, the manipulation, Lindsay's threats, the knife. I babbled, desperate to make them understand, to unburden myself of the horrific truth. Finally, my parents showed up, their faces ashen, accompanied by the school counselor, a young woman with a perpetually sympathetic, yet ultimately useless, expression. They explained what had happened, gesturing to my bloodied hands, to the furious principal. I desperately told them about Lindsay, about the knife, about the last few months, how she had been acting, how she had changed, how she had made me do it. The counselor, her expression unreadable, had a small laptop open on her desk, a flash drive plugged into the side. Without a word, she clicked play on the video. The principal nodded, a grim, knowing look on his face. My parents exchanged a worried glance, then all eyes turned to the screen. We watched in silence, the only sound the faint whir of the laptop's fan. My blood turned to ice in my veins as I watched the grainy security footage of the corner staircase. I stood there, alone in the stairwell, my back to the camera, bantering to the tiled wall. My parents cringed, recoiling in horror, as they watched me mercilessly assault Marcus. Only the two of us were visible in the stairwell, just me and Marcus's crumpled form. No Lindsay, no rose gold dress, no knife, nothing. Just me, talking to empty air, screaming at a ghost, driven to violence by a hallucination. The words of the principal, the counselor, my parents, faded into a dull roar. The world had split open again, and this time, I knew there was no patching it back together. That was the day I truly learned that the horror wasn't just out there. It was also in here, a seed planted in that crumpled car, nurtured by guilt, and blossoming into a terrifying, inescapable reality. This was the true beginning of the weary wanderer, the haunted everyman, the one who started running, not just from what the world held, but from what his own mind could conjure. Total characters, 9877. The scream, when it finally tore through the kitchen, was less a sound and more a physical rupture in the fabric of the night. It was the raw, wet shriek of a man realizing too late that his body was being repurposed, that the world was a slaughterhouse disguised as a five-star dining experience. My blood ran cold, a familiar, unwelcome guest coiling in my gut. This wasn't the first time I'd heard a sound like that, a sound that spoke of flesh tearing and sanity unraveling. But something about its desperate finality, its sudden, guttural stop, told me this horror was of a different vintage, a bespoke atrocity tailored just for Carparelli's discerning clientele. And for me, it was just another Tuesday night, another stain on the soul, another reason to keep moving, to never stay in one place long enough for the shadows to truly settle. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the industrial dishwasher, the incessant thrum of the restaurant's hidden machinery, all of it faded into a dull drone beneath the ringing echo of that dying scream, a siren song for the damned. I closed my eyes for a split second, seeing not the mundane gleam of stainless steel, but the ghostly outlines of countless horrors I'd collected, like souvenirs of the abyss, each one whispering the same cynical truth. You're never truly safe. Vance, not from them, not from yourself. My hand, slick with grease and dishwater, instinctively went to my wrist, my thumb tracing the worn metal of my old analog watch. A useless habit in a world where time had ceased to make any goddamn sense at all. It was a grounding ritual, a desperate plea for something, anything, to remain constant in the face of the encroaching madness. But even the watch felt heavier now, colder, as if it too had absorbed the chill radiating from the sound of a man being vivisected just a few yards away, behind a closed door. The kind of door that, in my experience, usually led to nothing but pain. Funny how a single sound can rearrange your entire reality. Just a few hours before, my biggest concern was the pile of greasy platters that seemed to multiply faster than I could scrub them clean. This was Carparelli's. After all, a monument to excess where the rich came to validate their existence, and I came to earn enough cash to vanish again for a few months. It was a job like any other. Another temporary anchor in a life built on impermanence. A place where the worst thing I expected to find was a stubborn clump of risotto. I was wrong. I was always wrong. I'd been at Carparelli's for just over a year, long enough for the novelty of washing the city's most expensive dinnerware to wear off, but not long enough to actually put down roots. That was the point. Of course, no roots, no expectations, no attachments, just the rhythm of the work. Scrub, rinse, stack, repeat. The roar of the sprayer, the sizzle of hot water on cold porcelain, the clatter of cutlery. It was a monotonous symphony, loud enough to drown out most of the noise in my head, which suited me just fine. My worn leather jacket hung on a hook by the staff entrance, a familiar scent of stale cigarettes and road dust clinging to its seams, waiting for the moment I'd shrug it on and disappear into the night again. Carparelli's was one of those places that people booked months in advance, where the average dinner cost more than my weekly pay, and the clientele probably had names that were also tax shelters. I rarely saw them, stuck as I was in the humid, clangorous purgatory of the dish pit, but there was a small, grimy window in the kitchen that offered a sliver of a view into the dining area. When I stacked the clean plates, I'd sometimes catch a glimpse, a sea of black tuxedos and shimmering gowns, diamond necklaces glittering under the soft amber light, top hats, even, and the gloves, always the gloves, so many of them, pristine white or polished black leather, covering the hands that held the forks that fed the mouths that came to Carparelli's for an experience. I'd always found it a bit theatrical, a little too much pomp for a meal, but who was I to judge the eccentricities of the elite? I was just the guy who cleaned up after their opulent messes. The pay was good, surprisingly good for a job that mostly involved getting soaked to the bone and smelling faintly of stale food. It kept my go bag perpetually topped up with emergency cash and protein bars, kept Buster fed when he was with me, and kept me from having to think too hard about where I was or where I was going. Just enough to move, always enough to move. I got along with the line cooks well enough, a motley crew of stressed out, perpetually sweating individuals who communicated mostly in grunts and profanity. But the head chef, the enigmatic figure everyone simply called Chef, was another story. He wasn't the screaming, pan-throwing type I'd expected. No Gordon Ramsay theatrics here. Chef was quiet, almost unnervingly calm. He moved through the kitchen like a ghost. His presence felt more than seen, his voice a low, even murmur that cut through the chaos without ever rising above a conversational tone. It was unsettling, too composed, too much control, like a predator observing its prey, unhurried, knowing. I'd learned to trust the loud ones, the ones whose anger was right on the surface. It was the quiet ones, the ones with secrets, who made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Chef's biggest secret was his special meal. It was the main draw, a dish so exclusive it had to be ordered days in advance. A culinary myth cooked only by him, in a private, soundproofed room at the very back of the kitchen. The door to that room was always, without fail, closed, locked. I suspected no one, not even his most trusted sous chefs, knew what went on in there. No one knew the ingredients, the process, the magic. It felt less like a kitchen and more like an operating theater, or perhaps a confessional for culinary sins. I'd seen him disappear into it countless times, sometimes carrying odd-shaped packages wrapped in butcher paper, other times just slipping in, empty-handed, leaving only a lingering scent that wasn't quite spices, wasn't quite meat, but something sharper, metallic, like a fresh cut. Last night, my shift began like any other. 6 p.m. The dinner rush was still an hour off, so I started on the prep dishes, the mountains of pots, pans, and mixing bowls left by the morning and afternoon crews. My hands worked on autopilot, scrubbing away the remnants of sauces, char, and God knows what else. It was mindless, meditative work, exactly what I sought. The hours melted away, marked only by the escalating clatter and the growing aroma of roasted meats and garlic from the main kitchen. Around 6:30 p.m., the first wave of dinner plates began to arrive, scraped clean, mostly by the waitstaff, piled onto trolleys and wheeled into my domain. Tonight, there was a new kid on the floor, fresh-faced and perpetually flustered. I watched him through the small kitchen window, tripping over his own feet, trying to navigate the intricate dance of a high-end dining room. Rookie mistake, I thought, when I grabbed the first stack of customer plates and felt a distinct lump on one of them. Waiters were supposed to pre-scrape everything before it hit the dish pit. This kid clearly hadn't. I sighed, a resigned murmur. Just my luck, always something extra. I picked up the heavy stack, the ceramic cold and slick against my forearms, and lowered them into the sink, already half filled with steaming, soapy water. They clung gently against the metal bottom, submerging with a soft gurgle. The water immediately grew cloudy, tinged with the faint sheen of forgotten sauces. I started with the top plate, scrubbing vigorously with a bristled brush, then slid it onto the plastic rack that would go into the monstrous, steam-belching dishwasher. I repeated the process. Another plate, another. Then I felt it. Something soft, yet distinctly solid, brushing against my hand as I moved the plates around. Must be that lump of food the new kid missed. I grumbled internally. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the rhythmic motion of my scrubbing, but it was insistent, bumping against my knuckles, then gliding along my palm. It felt odd, not like a piece of bread or a chunk of meat. It was longer, firmer, almost cylindrical, too firm for old food. Maybe some kind of odd utensil, I mused, my brow furrowing. But no, the texture was wrong, too yielding, yet with an inner resilience that felt disturbingly familiar. Somehow, it brushed against my fingers again, a wet, slick contact that made my stomach churn with a vague, formless dread. This time, I paid closer attention. It wasn't just long, it had a distinct, segmented feel. And then, at one end, a surprising hardness, a nail, a fingernail. My breath hitched. It was a stupid thought, a crazy thought, but it was there, nagging at the back of my mind. against every instinct that screamed at me to leave it alone, to just let it wash down the drain and pretend I hadn't felt anything. My reluctant conscience kicked in. What if it's something important? What if it's a piece of something vital? And, more selfishly, what if it clogs the drain and I have to reach in and clear it later? Better to get it now. The thought was a weak excuse, a thin veneer over a deeper, more troubling curiosity. I took a deep, shaky breath, the humid kitchen air feeling suddenly thick and cloying in my lungs. My fingers, pruny from the hot water, delved back into the murky depths, searching. They closed around the object. It was undeniably elongated, disturbingly organic in its firmness. And yes, at one end, there was indeed a small, hard, convex surface, a nail. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against bone. I pulled my hand out of the water. The strange object clutched tightly, dripping. The light from the overhead fluorescence glinted off the water, off my wet, trembling fingers. And then I saw it, the nail, the pale, wrinkled skin surrounding it, the ridged knuckle, and the raw, bloody, jagged tear at the base. It wasn't a piece of food. It wasn't a utensil. It wasn't even a full finger. It was an index finger, severed from a hand, clearly, messily, violently. A stump of raw flesh where it had been torn away, still weeping a few thin rivulets of dark, almost black, blood into the dishwater. The skin, though submerged, was already taking on that waxy, waterlogged look of something that has been dead too long. A guttural sound tore from my throat, a choked gasp of pure, unadulterated revulsion. It wasn't a scream exactly, not yet, but a raw, animal noise of disgust and horror. My grip faltered. The finger, slick with water and what little blood remained, slipped from my fingers and plopped back into the murky sink with an obscene splotch, disappearing beneath the floating suds. "What the hell was that, Vance?" Chef's voice cut through the suddenly ringing silence, his tone sharp, his presence unnervingly close behind me. I hadn't even heard him approach. My stomach heaved, threatening to empty its contents onto the pristine tile floor. "There's something in the sink," I choked out, my voice thin, reedy, barely my own. My throat felt constricted, like I'd swallowed a handful of sand. It's a finger, a human finger. Even I could hear the fear in my voice, the frantic edge of disbelief. Chef let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, as if I'd just announced a minor inconvenience, like a clogged drain. "A human finger. Vance, are you quite sure? You've been working too many late nights. Probably just a piece of, well, something else. There's no way there's a human finger in there." His voice was smooth, calm, entirely too reassuring. It had the same quality as a doctor delivering bad news with a comforting smile. Only this time, the doctor was a chef, and the news was that a piece of someone was floating in my workplace. Before I could protest, before I could articulate the sheer, horrifying certainty of what I'd just seen, Chef plunged his hand into the water, a stark white chef's sleeve disappearing into the cloudy suds. He fished around for a moment, then pulled his hand out, a small, pale object clutched between his thumb and forefinger. The water streamed off it, revealing it with horrifying clarity. The index finger, still dripping, still with the raw, ragged edge. Chef looked at it. His expression, usually so impassive, shifted, just a flicker. A brief tightening around the eyes, a slight clenching of his jaw. But it was there. He recognized it. He knew exactly what it was. For a terrifying second, I thought he might blanch, might finally react with the horror this situation deserved. But then, just as quickly, the mask of calm resettled. He looked up at me, his eyes disturbingly flat, almost bored. "Oh," he said, his voice as casual as if he'd just found a stray pea in a bowl of mashed potatoes. That's not supposed to be in there. And with that, he turned, still holding the severed digit, and walked away. Just like that. No questions, no alarm, no hint of a plan, just a mild, almost apologetic dismissal. Not supposed to be in there. The words echoed in my head, a perverse mantra. No shit, Sherlock. It's supposed to be attached to a person, a living person, preferably. The casualness of it was what truly sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just that he wasn't reacting like a normal human being. It was that his reaction implied a context I couldn't even begin to fathom. Where was it supposed to be then? Was there a designated place for discarded human appendages at Carparelli's? Was this a regular occurrence? The thought curdled my insides. I watched him go, a macabre Pied Piper leading a severed finger through the bustling kitchen. He moved with an odd stealth, subtly trying to conceal the finger in his hand as he passed by the other cooks, who were too engrossed in their own furious dance of sizzling pans and shouted orders to notice. He disappeared around the corner, heading in the direction of his private, soundproofed sanctum, the secret room where he conjured his exclusive special meal. The door hissed shut behind him. He reappeared barely a minute later, wiping his hands on a pristine white towel, his face once again a picture of serene, almost unsettling, calm. He moved back to his station, picking up a glistening chef's knife, beginning to slice something with unnerving precision, as if he hadn't just handled a dismembered body part. The whole thing felt like a particularly twisted dream, a scene from a bad horror movie I desperately wanted to wake up from. But the lingering, metallic tang in the air, the nausea churning in my gut, confirmed its horrifying reality. This is a police matter, my mind screamed. An ambulance. Somebody. But Chef was acting as if he'd merely retrieved a dropped spoon, or worse, as if this was normal. A routine mishap in the high-stakes world of fine dining. I knew the finger had come in on one of the customers' dirty plates. Did that mean one of the patrons was currently bleeding out in the dining room? Missing a digit? And if so, why was there no commotion out front? No screams? No sirens? Why the hell was everything so quiet? Chef must have felt my unwavering gaze, because he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. They were devoid of emotion, like polished stone. Then he started walking toward me, a slow, deliberate stride that felt predatory, like a shark circling. My breath hitched. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to bolt through the nearest exit and never look back. But the reluctant conscience, that festering flaw that always got me into trouble, held me rooted to the spot. I needed answers. Or maybe I just needed to know if I was going completely insane. Is the person who lost the finger? Are they all right? I stammered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Shouldn't we call the police? Or an ambulance? Or anybody? My voice was barely a whisper. Chef stopped just a few feet from me, close enough for me to smell the faint, oddly sweet scent that seemed to cling to him. He smiled then, a small, humorless curve of his lips. Don't you worry, Vance, it's being taken care of. The customer is quite all right. A minor mishap. The matter is being dealt with internally. His eyes held mine, a silent, chilling warning in their depth. But I understand. It can be traumatic to find such things. Why don't you take a short break? Go sit down in the staff lounge. Clear your head. My head was anything but clear. It was a whirlwind of nausea and disbelief. Every fiber of my being screamed that nothing about this was all right, and nothing was being taken care of. But the offer of a break, of a chance to escape the infernal heat and the smell of stale blood, was too tempting. I nodded numbly and walked away, my legs feeling like lead. The staff lounge was a cramped, windowless box, smelling of stale coffee and unwashed uniforms. I sank onto a worn couch, my mind racing. No police, no ambulance, no questions. This wasn't how things worked. People don't just lose fingers and then have the matter dealt with internally by a chef who acts like he's misfiled a receipt. This wasn't normal. None of it. A cold dread, far deeper than the initial shock, began to settle in my bones. I couldn't stay. There was no way I could finish my shift. I had to get out. Every second I remained in Carparelli's felt like a second closer to becoming another minor mishap. I pushed myself off the couch, my muscles protesting, and headed back toward the kitchen, my resolve hardening with every step. I'd tell Chef I was leaving, and then I'd walk out, disappear into the night, and never look back. This was exactly why I kept moving, to escape the moments when the normal world revealed its monstrous underbelly. As I approached the kitchen, a low murmur of voices reached my ears. They were coming from Chef's private room, the one with the perpetually closed door. My footsteps slowed. My hand instinctively went to my wrist again, tracing the cold metal of my watch, a useless tick in a moment that stretched into an eternity. The voices were muffled, distorted by the thick door, but as I drew closer, leaning in, I could start to distinguish words, snippets of a desperate conversation. Please, it was a mistake. I didn't mean to leave it sitting on the plate. I'm not sure how it happened, but I promise it will not happen again. The voice was high-pitched, trembling, laced with abject terror. It was the new waiter. I recognized his shaky cadence. He was begging. A different voice, low and resonant, cut him off. Chef's voice. No, you're right. It won't happen again. There was an unnerving calm in his tone, a cold promise that sent chills down my spine. But that doesn't solve the dilemma we are facing. Someone has paid for the chef's special, and you know the rules. One man's payment becomes another man's meal. I needed that finger for the customer who ordered my special. Do you really think I can serve that after it has been sitting in a sink, stewing in dishwater? A wave of nausea crashed over me, stronger this time, almost buckling my knees. Payment? Meal? My mind reeled, struggling to make sense of the words, to piece together the unspeakable implications. No, I know you can't serve it now. The waiter whimpered, his voice thick with tears. The absolute despair in his tone was palpable, a chilling echo of his deepest fears. He knew. He understood. And whatever he understood, it was pure, unadulterated horror. No, I can't! Chef's voice grew colder, a razor-sharp edge of irritation now discernible beneath the calm. But the customer has already paid, and we can't make him pay again. So, I will have to get the ingredient from another source. No, please, I will find you another. Please, anything but this. The waiter's plea was a strangled sob, a desperate animalistic cry for mercy. He was utterly broken, reduced to a desperate, pitiful wheeze. Then came the scream. It wasn't a whimper, or a sob, or a plea. It was a single piercing shriek of pure, agonizing pain, cut off abruptly, as if a hand had been clamped over a mouth, or a throat had been severed. Sound was muffled by the thick door, but standing there, my ear pressed against the cold metal. It was clear, too clear. It was the sound of flesh tearing, of bone grinding, of a life being violently, horribly extinguished. The sound of a human body being harvested. Another source. The words slammed into me, finally making a horrifying, sickening sense. My flight response, a finely honed instinct cultivated over years of running from things that defied explanation, kicked in with a vengeance. My legs moved before my brain could even process the command. I didn't think. I didn't pause. I didn't try to reason. I just ran. Through the bustling kitchen, past the wide-eyed line cooks who seemed to shrink back from my wild, desperate flight. I didn't care. I didn't look back. The heat, the smells, the noise, it all blurred into an oppressive wall, and I pushed through it, gasping for breath. my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I burst through a side door, out into the cool, blessed night air, not slowing until I was halfway across the alley, my lungs burning. But before I cleared the kitchen, before I truly escaped the gilded nightmare that was Carparelli's, my gaze flickered, drawn by some morbid compulsion, to the small, grimy window that offered a view into the main dining area. The first thing I saw was a large table, bathed in the soft, intimate glow of the chandeliers. A group of men, dressed in impeccable tuxedos, their faces serene, almost rapturous, were raising their wine glasses in a silent toast. And then I saw their hands, the gloves. I realized with a fresh wave of nausea, were gone. And every man at that table was missing something. On one hand, each of them, from the pinky to the thumb, every single finger had been neatly, surgically removed. The stumps, raw and red, were stark against their starched white cuffs, ghastly monuments to some unspeakable, horrifying appetite. My gut lurched. The nausea, which had been a dull throb, became an overwhelming, violent surge. I turned away, stumbling blindly into the oppressive darkness of the alley, my mind reeling, my vision swimming. The elegant, exclusive Carparelli's, the secret room, the chef's special meal, the missing fingers, the payment, the another source. It all clicked into place, a monstrous jigsaw puzzle of human depravity and unspeakable horror. The rich and fancy. They didn't just come to Carparelli's for a meal. They came for a specific, gruesome delicacy, and they paid for it, not with money, but with pieces of themselves. And then they consumed pieces of others. The thought was so profoundly, viscerally disgusting, so utterly vile, that it threatened to shatter the fragile shield of cynicism I had carefully constructed over the years. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a human abattoir disguised as a temple of haute cuisine. Another stain, another scar, another reminder that the true monsters didn't lurk in the shadows. They wore tuxedos. My hand instinctively went to my worn leather jacket, pulling it tighter around me, as if it could somehow ward off the lingering chill of the night, the pervasive horror that now clung to my skin like an invisible shroud. I pulled out my keys, fumbling with the lock on the passenger side of my beat-up pickup truck. Buster, my scruffy companion, was waiting inside, curled up on the seat, his familiar presence a small, flickering flame in the encroaching darkness. I needed to get in, get out, and drive until the memory of Carparelli's and the things that went on behind its closed doors faded into the rearview mirror. But I knew with the weary certainty of a man who had seen too much that some things never truly fade. They just burrow deeper, waiting for the next moment of quiet, the next stretch of lonely road, to remind you that the world was still, irrevocably broken. Character count 9788. The barbed end of the poker plunged into her skull with a wet, sickening thud, a sound that will forever be the crescendo of my personal hell. I felt the bone give way, a brittle crunch like dry leaves underfoot, and then the tool eased into the soft, yielding folds of her mind. A tiny, choked sob escaped her lips as she pitched forward, a puppet with severed strings, landing face down with another gut-wrenching impact. Her small hand, still clutched in a miniature fist, lay still. The world, already a kaleidoscope of terror, fractured into 1,000 shards of agony. My Maya, my little girl. It all started earlier that day, under a sun that promised nothing but peace. The heat was a living thing that Friday, pressing down on the asphalt, making the air shimmer above the manicured lawns of Elmwood Drive. Late August, the kind of afternoon that felt like the last gasp of true summer, sweet and heavy with the scent of cut grass and blooming hydrangeas. My wife, Jessica, and our daughter, Maya, were off on one of their girls' days, a ritual of shopping for sparkly things and gossiping over overpriced coffees. That left me and Kyle, our boy, to forge our own masculine adventure. We were strolling back from the park, Kyle's hand a warm, damp anchor in mine. 8 years old, just like his twin sister. And still at that age where the idea of a boys' day with Dad was less a chore and more a grand expedition. The park had been good to us. Scraped knees, a victorious capture of the swings, and a tactical retreat from a particularly aggressive patch of dandelions. My worn leather jacket, a relic of a life I hadn't yet started running from, was slung over my shoulder. Too warm for the sun, but a comforting weight nonetheless. I remember absently checking my old analog wristwatch, a nervous tick I hadn't even registered yet, more for the comfort of its familiar weight than any actual need to track time. It was a perfect, unremarkable day, the kind you catalog in your mind as safe. Then the jingle cut through the lazy afternoon. It was that jingle, the one etched into the collective subconscious of every kid who'd ever chased a truck down a suburban street. A tinny off-key rendition of Pop Goes the Weasel, piped out from tinny, roof-mounted loudspeakers. Most parents, myself included, considered it a nuisance, a siren song for sugar-crazed demons in miniature. But on this particular Friday, something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the slightly distorted quality of the speakers. It was a subtle disharmony, a sour note lingering beneath the cheerful melody, like a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. Kyle's head snapped up, his blue eyes wide and luminous as twin summer skies, fixed on the sound. A little tug of blonde hair fell across his forehead as he looked up at me, his face a silent, pleading question. "Sure, bud," I said, a grin already forming. How could I say no? This was exactly the kind of simple, sun-drenched memory you build a childhood on. A moment I would later replay a million times, searching for the crack in the facade, the moment I should have known better. He bounced with excitement, a blur of motion as he pounded off down the sidewalk. His laughter, bright and clear, mingled with the jingle as the boxy white truck, emblazoned with the faded, cheerful logo of Mr. Frosty's ice cream, turned the corner and trundled slowly up our quiet suburban tract. It was a standard-issue vehicle, no different from 1,000 others. Yet even from this distance, something in my gut tightened. The sun seemed to dim, just perceptibly, as its shadow stretched over the street. The truck crunched to a stop beside Kyle, maybe 25 feet from where I stood, suddenly rooted to the spot. My son, a small, vibrant figure, took his place beneath the awning, his head tilted back, eyes scanning the luridly colored menu plastered on the side. I couldn't see the driver. The window, I noted, was heavily tinted, an opaque shield against the afternoon light. But someone had to be in there, because the serving window scraped open. The sound clawed at my ears, raw and unpleasantly loud for the distance. The awful shriek of abused metal grinding on rusty rollers, like fingernails on a chalkboard, amplified 100 times. It was a sound that didn't belong on a sunny afternoon. It belonged in a nightmare, in the echoing halls of an abandoned factory. The interior of the truck was drenched in shadow, not just ordinary shadow, but a deep, inky blackness that seemed to defy the slant of afternoon sunlight, battling it from outside. It was a void, a hungry mouth, sucking in all light and warmth. I should have known then. I should have turned, grabbed Kyle, and run. Every fiber of my being, every primitive instinct, was screaming. The air raid siren in my head was a full-throated howl, demanding immediate flight. The chill that had started as a nibble at my bones was now a bone-deep cold, radiating from the truck, seeping into the pavement, biting at my exposed skin. It felt like the sudden, profound drop in temperature before a storm. Only this storm was not of nature's making. It was a cold that spoke of death, of something ancient and terrible. Up until that moment, I had been ambling, leisurely motoring up the sidewalk without a care in the world, letting Kyle have his moment. But that chill, that profound wrongness, triggered something visceral. For the first time in my life, I reacted without thought, without my usual measured caution. I fell into a sprint. It was a full tilt, blind, panicked rush down the sidewalk. My chest squeezed tight. My swollen, thundering heart fought my lungs for space in a ribcage that felt too tiny, too full of drying cement. The houses, the respectable, upper-middle-class family homes with their white trim and manicured lawns, blurred into a colorful, meaningless streak as I bombed up the sidewalk. My legs scissored beneath me, burning with effort. My arms pumped like pistons. My cold breath whip-cracked through my shrinking lungs, tasting metallic and acrid. I don't think Kyle heard me. I didn't yell. Couldn't. My throat was full of gluey breath. Nothing more. There would be no sound coming from me, other than the thin, reedy whistle of air sawing through my lungs. Maybe the slap thud of my sneakers hammering the pavement, but I doubt even that registered over the cheerful, distorted jingle. He sensed something was wrong, though. Sensed it with that preternatural ability afforded only to children, the one that tells them when mom and dad are fighting even when they can't hear it from across the house. He turned, his blonde hair whipping in the wind, his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, like two little oceans cooling off a face of sunshine, fixed on me. His expression shifted from childish excitement to a dawning, innocent fear. And then the ice cream man took him. A mass of black, segmented spider legs exploded out of the darkness of the truck's interior. They moved with impossible speed, a seething, tangled horror of hairy, jointed feelers. They didn't just grab, they sucked him through the window like shrink wrap through a vacuum cleaner. With a wet, pliant sound, Kyle snapped back. A rag doll into the writhing tangle. He didn't have time to scream. There was a whoosh of air from his mouth, a desperate, truncated gasp, as the spider legs tore him back by the stomach. He blipped through the window, his head smacking the top of the frame with a sickening crack before lolling like a dead thing on his neck as he disappeared into the suffocating darkness of the truck. Now I did scream, a raw, guttural wail that tore from my throat. Kyle's name ripped out on a thread of pure agony. I ran harder, the world tilting and swaying underfoot like I was barreling up the deck of a ship in stormy waters. My vision blurred, doubled, snapped together, then shot into excruciating focus as I lurched up to the ice cream truck, my hand outstretched as if I could pluck him back from the maw that had swallowed him. Then I froze. My lungs snapped shut like rubber bands, and a thin whistle of air escaped my nostrils. My whole body crawled with a cold, greasy dread. My heart was galloping through my rib cage like a mile-wide herd of bison, each beat a painful, desperate drum. The inside of the truck was impossible. It was too big. It was a dystopian nightmare. Like the truck was a portal, a shimmering, distorted gateway to the killing floor of a massive slaughterhouse. The rotten husks of cattle chutes, slick with something dark and glistening, and blood-stained linoleum textured a sprawling, incomprehensible plant like the fossils of a forgotten, monstrous industry. But it wasn't forgotten. It was horrifyingly, brutally active. It was dark, soaked in shadow, but I could see them, pale, fragile shapes, limping along the chutes, shuffling towards a doom I couldn't comprehend. Their faces were slack, eyes glazed and vacant, like broken, violated dolls. The livestock was children, hundreds of them, caked in their own filth, their small, broken bodies shuffling along the chutes, while hulking figures in blood-stained aprons and USGI cold weather masks butchered them alive. There were no screams. That was the worst part, the part that burrowed into my soul and set up residence. It was deadly silent. Just the weak shuffle of small feet, a horrifying counterpoint to the wet tear of curved knives opening throats, the syrupy slap of blood hitting the floor. The dead were hoisted, ankle up, on a conveyor system, like at a dry cleaner's, an absurd, sickening detail, which zipped them off through a darkened portal into the unknown, a hot trail of blood still spraying from their severed necks. It was a factory of despair, an assembly line of shattered innocence. The smell was cloying, metallic, like a butcher shop mixed with something sweet and rotten. Perhaps the lingering scent of unconsumed ice cream, or the sickly sweet odor of fear and waste. I couldn't breathe, couldn't blink. My stomach churned with nausea, a hot rush of vomit threatening to erupt. I tasted bile at the back of my throat, the bitter tang of pure terror. Then something grabbed out at me. A pale, small hand, sticky and cold, reached through the opening. I jumped back with a strangled cry, a new wave of horror washing over me. It was Kyle. His head was pitched at a wrong, impossible angle on his broken neck. His eyes were dead, vacant, no longer the warm ocean puddles they had been, but two icy marbles that could freeze a soul with a single glance. But there was still a piece of him buried somewhere in there, a flicker of his essence, a final, desperate act of love, because he said a single word in a voice I would never, ever hear again, a voice raspy and thin, imbued with a terrible, knowing sorrow. "Run!" Then, with an almost deliberate motion, he slammed closed the serving window. As it cracked shut, I saw the massive spider legs encircle him from behind, like interlacing fingers. A final, suffocating embrace. The hairy legs covered his mouth, his eyes. They tore him backwards with a wet, tearing sound and sent him into the slaughter line, gone for good. The truck's engine rumbled to life, a low, predatory growl. The ice cream jingle, impossibly cheerful, crackled from its roof-mounted speaker as it pulled away. It growled up the street, turned the corner with a deceptive slowness, and disappeared from view, carrying off my only son. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged sob tearing through me. I stood there, swaying, the sun suddenly too bright, the air too still, the jingle echoing in the vast, empty space where my heart had been. I'll never forget the way my wife screamed when she came home, the sheer, visceral devastation of it. The police lights, hellish blue and red, painting our suburban house in shades of emergency, detectives in cheap suits, their faces grim, asking questions I couldn't answer. When I told her Kyle was gone, her face crumpled. She dropped to her knees on our perfectly manicured lawn and howled, a primal sound of loss that would haunt my dreams for years. I pulled Maya close, hugging her trembling body, burying my face in her soft, blonde curls. The warmth of her a desperate comfort in the rapidly chilling world. We cried together, a small island of grief in an ocean of incomprehension. The first 24 hours are the most important in abduction cases, one of the detectives had said, his voice flat, professional. But I knew better, knew what I'd seen, knew my boy was gone for good, which, as it turned out, wasn't entirely the case. But I knew it all the same on that afternoon Kyle stopped for ice cream. A quiet certainty, cold and absolute, settled in my gut. I didn't tell the detectives what I had seen. How could I? How could I explain the impossible dimensions, the spider-legged horrors, the silent slaughterhouse? They would have thought I was spinning tall tales, trying to disabuse my guilty conscience of the fact that I had, in their eyes, somehow failed to protect my son. They would have slammed me into an interrogation cell as the lead suspect, a father unraveling under the weight of grief and delusion. So I lied, told them a Mr. Frosty's ice cream truck had taken him. They put out a statewide APB. They found nothing. Of course they didn't. Jessica and I didn't sleep that night. Her face was puffy, eyes red and swollen from endless tears. Maya, despite being only 8, was smart as hell, quick to catch on. She understood what was happening, the gaping void that had swallowed her brother. She also seemed to sense that Mom and Dad needed to be alone, so she put herself to bed without much fuss. a small, brave figure disappearing into the darkness of her room. I felt numb, my whole body cold, a physical manifestation of the lie I was living. It was a sick lie, giving Jessica any hope. I knew deep down, in the furthest pits of my stomach, that our son was dead. All those children were dead. Blindly shuffled up the murder chute to those massive things in bloody aprons, with their gore-drenched knives and their horrific USGI cold weather masks. Jessica said something, her voice hoarse, barely audible. I looked up, pulling myself from the abyss of my thoughts. "What?" She blew snot into a crumpled tissue, her movements sluggish, mechanical. "Kyle's out there. We should be looking for him, trying to find that truck." She cut me an accusing glare, her eyes still burning despite the tears. She blamed me. I knew she did. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't fair. But I knew. "The police said we—" I stopped mid-sentence. A pale shape, gowned in her PJ onesie, clutching her pink blanket like a shield, had appeared in the doorway of the living room. Maya. "Honey," I murmured, rising and sweeping Maya into my arms. Her small body was trembling, cold despite the summer night. She looked at me, her eyes wide. Wide with a fear that wasn't just the shock of a child who'd seen her parents' grief. It was something else, something deeper. Fear of me? No. No. I knew at that instant what she was afraid of. "He's home, Daddy," she said, her voice a thin whisper that sliced through the suffocating silence. "Kyle's home." The thing at the back door wasn't our son. It looked like Kyle. It walked like him. A dragging, clumsy gait that was just off enough to register as deeply wrong. But it wasn't him. Not really. It was pale, drenched in mud that seemed to cling to it like a second skin. Its eyes, those once warm, ocean blue puddles, were cold and dead. Two icy marbles that could freeze you with a single, knowing look. They were fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. Jessica sobbed, a sound of relief and profound anguish mingling, and wrapped the thing in an embrace. It didn't hug back. Its small, stiff arms hung limply at its sides. Those two cold eyes, locked on mine, held a knowing smile that was just beginning to break its face. "Why'd you do it, Daddy?" it said as we led it into the living room, a question delivered in a voice that was too flat, too devoid of inflection for a child. A chill, more profound than the one from the truck, settled over me. I could feel Maya's body tense against mine. Knew something bad was about to happen. "What?" my wife asked, her voice trembling, looking from me to the thing she believed was our son. "Why'd you try to kill me? Try to kill me, huh, Daddy? Why? I thought you loved me. Dad, I thought you—" Its head reared back impossibly far on its neck, a movement that defied human anatomy, bone and muscle stretching and distorting with a wet crackle. Its mouth curved into a dark, perfect O. A throaty, gurgling sound, wet and thick, escaped its throat. Its eyes rolled back into their sockets, showing only the whites, stark against the pale, mud-streaked skin. It was no longer Kyle. It was a caricature, a grotesque puppet. Jessica looked at me, eyes wide with a dawning terror, then back at the abomination that wore her son's face. I don't think she realized she had started backing up. I don't think I did any either. We retreated into the living room, the Kyle thing bearing down on us, forcing us back, a predator stalking its prey. Maya had started to sob into my shirt, her tears warm and salty, dampening my chest, a stark contrast to the growing cold in the room. The O of the Kyle thing's mouth continued to expand, drawing further and further back, skin stretching taut, muscles straining. Only this time its lips didn't move, and the voice, deeper, warped, like the words of a demon from the mouth of the possessed, came hissing out of its throat, a chorus of gravel and slime. "Why, Dad, why'd you fucking do it? You like killing little kids? Dad? Want to kill Maya?" Want to see her pigtails wrapped in brain? Stop! My voice was weak, thin, a pathetic rasp against the guttural roar from the thing's throat. The thing chuckled, a vile, wet sound, as Kyle's mouth continued pulling back. Its lips were coated in a glistening bile, the smell faintly acrid, metallic. Its teeth were brown and jagged, like broken porcelain shards. Too many of them. Too sharp. A predator's grin. Jessica's head was on a swivel between our son and me, her eyes darting, wide with a horror that was finally, unequivocally, sinking in. Her legs hit the couch, and gravity planted her ass on the cushion with a surprise, "Oh!" It was lost in the hoarse voice that had hijacked my son's mouth. "Want to bash her little head in? Hammer it until it crumples and all those little girl thoughts and feelings come spilling out." The corners of my son's mouth tore. Rivulets of blood, dark and viscous, sledded down its throat, leaving glistening trails on the pale skin. Its mouth continued to pull back, like its head was splitting open on a hinge, bone grinding against bone. "Make him stop, Dad," Maya moaned, her voice muffled against my chest, her tiny body trembling violently. I couldn't speak. My voice was lost, swallowed by the terror and the rising gorge in my throat. I fished for it, my Adam's apple bobbing, but it wouldn't come. My hands, clammy and useless, felt for something, anything, to defend us. The Kyle thing's mouth split wider, wider, bone and tendons snapping and crackling with wet, tearing sounds. Its lower face was soaked in blood and bile, a gruesome, impossible maw. "Want to be a butcher, Dad?" The voice within my son chuckled, a cold, mocking sound that resonated deep in my chest. Hack through gristle and vein and the stretch of pink flesh connecting tiny heads to tiny bodies? Feel the warm rush of blood over your hands? Feel your knife scrape bone as they drain? I saw its throat distend and undulate, like there was a knot of fingers trying to claw their way out, something alive and writhing beneath the skin. Want to watch the light bleed from their eyes as their life bleeds from their throat? Want to, Dad? Want to. The words were laced with a perverse glee, a sick invitation. Then the Kyle thing's head tore back with a final, gruesome snap, its cheeks ripping, its mouth forced open in an awful, hellish grin. And the massive, hairy spider legs, thicker now, pulsating, exploded from its throat. A black, writhing tide of segmented limbs, each tipped with a barbed, chitinous claw. My wife started to scream, a terrified, choked sound that was instantly cut off. One of the spider legs, thick as my arm, lashed out, a blur of black against the pale walls, and batted her across the face. Her head snapped around with a sickening crack, an unnatural angle, and she pitched forward with as much life in her bones as a sack of grain, landing in a heap on the couch, unmoving. That galvanized me into motion. A red haze descended, grief, rage, and a primal, animalistic need to protect the last piece of my world. I tossed Maya onto the couch, her small body landing with a soft thump, and lunged for the rack of fireplace tools. My fingers closed around the heavy, cold metal of the poker, its barbed end a promising weapon against the impossible horror unfolding before me. The spider legs crackled and snapped, a writhing, flickering net of tendrils erupting from my son's broken mouth. They danced, a macabre ballet of death, their chitinous tips glistening. Maya was shrieking now, a pure, unadulterated sound of terror. Her face was crumpled, eyes wide and streaming tears, fixed on the monstrous thing that used to be her brother. The spider legs lunged for her, shot forward for her delicate little form, a black wave of intent. I tore the poker free of the fire rack and whipped around, using my forward momentum, the weight of the poker, and every ounce of desperate strength I could muster to bring the instrument down. I aimed for the pulsing mass, for the thing that had taken my family. Only I missed. Oh God, how I missed. Maya had lunged away from the spider thing trying to kill her. had lunged right into the arc of my swing, a desperate, childish movement for safety that sealed her doom. The barbed end of the poker hit the center of her skull and went burrowing into her brain. I felt bones snap like glass. I felt the poker ease into the spongy folds of her mind. She fell like she was a puppet, and I had cut her strings. A little sob escaped as she planted face down with a sickening thud. Her hand made a tiny fist, and then she died. The Kyle thing began to roar with laughter, a sound that chilled me to my core, somehow more horrifying than the screams of the dead children in the truck. It turned on me, its impossible mouth still split in that grotesque grin, the spider legs flickering and pulsing, snapping in all directions like 10 of those dealership tube men, a chaotic, murderous dance. "You like killing kids, Dad? You like?" Then the thing let out a surprise gasp, a sound of genuine shock that was utterly out of place. The spider legs snapped erect, like soldiers at attention. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the animation drained from my son's face. The impossible grin vanished. The dead eyes stared blankly. The end of the poker, which I'd wrenched free of Maya's broken mind, was now jutting from my son's left eye. His ocean blue eyeball had deflated, a thin run of pus and something else, something metallic and dark, ran down his cheek. In my blind, animalistic rage, after Maya fell, I had swung again, wildly, desperately, and this time, by some twist of cruel fate, I had connected. Then the tendril sucked back into its mouth with a final, throaty gurgle, a wet, collapsing sound, and my son pitched forward, a limp, dead weight, as dead as the rest of my family. I stood there, the poker still clutched in my hand, my entire body rigid. I was misted in my children's blood, the sticky warmth of it a testament to the horrors I had just witnessed and inflicted. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the ragged, painful gasps of my own breath. I looked at Maya, a tiny, crumpled heap, at Jessica, still and broken on the couch, and at Kyle, a pale, lifeless shell. And then the dam broke. I dropped the poker with a clatter that echoed in the sudden vastness of the house, and I started to cry, a raw, animal sound of utter despair. I can hear the sirens now, a distant wail growing steadily closer. The police will be here soon. They'll see the scene, the blood, the bodies, and they'll come to their conclusions. I know what they'll say. I'm writing this now, sitting here amidst the wreckage of my life, a silent warning, a desperate, pleading cry for others to listen. I'm not looking for absolution. There is no absolution for this. I'm broken. A man ruined by an ice cream truck that rode in on a hot summer day. I'm sure you'll see my name bolded in the paper, conjoined to some variation of the term family annihilator. But it wasn't me, not entirely. I bear blame, God, how I do. The choices I made, the desperate swings, the accidental blow, my failure to protect them, to comprehend the true, insidious nature of the horror. That guilt will haunt me until my last breath. But it wasn't all me. It was that thing, that truck, that impossible, monstrous portal. It reached into my life, into my home, and pulled everything I held dear into its sickening maw. And I, the ordinary man, was left to pick up the pieces, to be the last, haunted survivor. Please don't make the same mistakes I did. Be suspicious of the mundane. Be wary of the ordinary. And if your kids ask for ice cream, buy them a tub of the store-bought stuff. It's just as good, safer. Everything is safer than that jingle. This is how it begins. This is how you get marked. I'm marked. I know it now. I can feel the chill of it, an invisible brand, and I'll be running from it for the rest of my life. Total characters, 97801.